Chapter 21. Tit for Tat. Roger, the Rock's pirates have done it again. Riley came running up to the bow, clutching a fresh newspaper. Roger, perched there in his straw hat, looked up. Oh, what have they gotten into this time? Roger took the paper and scanned the bold headline. Rocks strike G8 Navy base. Total devastation in the second half of the Grand Line. His eyes widened. He flipped to the next article, then practically jumped in his seat. Another paper. Listen to this. Wanted. Captain Charles Rockefeller, newly promoted commander of the Rock's Pirates 8th Division. Bounty set at $1,000,000 berries. Fresh recruit or old legend reborn. He pointed to a grainy photograph. In it, Charles stood shoulder to shoulder with the notorious cadre known as the Overlord, their Haki-infused cleaving a tear in the very sky behind them. The sheer ferocity on display made Roger shake his head in disbelief. These young upstarts, they're monsters. Riley nudged him impatiently. Well, let them be. We've got our own course to set. Raleigh leaned in, examining the wanted poster. A wry smile played at his lips. Agreed. The Rocks can fight the Navy all they want. Our adventure waits for no one. With that, the three of them turned back to the ship's map, their minds already drifting toward the next horizon. Chapter 7. We're the men who will sail every sea, Roger proclaimed, tossing the newspaper skyward with a flourish. Yellowed sheets fluttered like giant confetti, drifting down around the cheering crew. Hold on. Why are you wasting perfectly good newsprint? Rayleigh called out, rubbing his forehead. We could have sold those for 50 Baileys. Roger clapped him on the shoulder, grin wide as the horizon. Bah! Who cares about petty costs? Let's have a banquet. Celebrate the Navy's G8 defeat in style. Huzzah! The others roared, pounding tables and stamping boots. We don't need an excuse that flimsy. Let's eat, drink, and make merry. Rayleigh shot them all a withering look. As first mate and quartermaster of the Roger Pirates, he kept a tight rein on the purse strings, and their coffers were perilously thin. The crew never robbed merchants. Every coin they'd ever earned went straight back into battle supplies or ransoms for captured foes. At best, they scraped together enough for daily provisions. Still, the destruction of the Navy's G8 fleet had set every seafaring mouth to watering. Rumors of that epic clash had spread faster than a typhoon, and now the Grand Line buzzed with excitement. No one paid any mind to the shy newcomer curled up at the stern. Charles blinked awake beneath the warm sunlight, his tousled hair tangling with the breeze. He sat up, squinting at the revelry around him, and wondered exactly what storm he'd sailed into. Charles groaned as he sat up, every nerve in his skull aching from last night's excess. The banquet had been a blur of fine wine and raucous laughter, far more than his constitution could handle, and sometime after the third flagon he'd blacked out. Now dawn's pale light filtered through the ships moored at the harbor. All around him, pirates lay sprawled across decks and barrels, snoring softly. As Charles pushed himself upright on trembling arms, he kept his gaze low, wary of any sudden movement. "Boss?" he croaked. Ivan was already at his side, concern etched on his scarred face. "You're up," he said quietly. When Charles blinked away the last of his drowsiness, he glanced around again. Rocks and the Golden Lion, two of the fiercest men he'd ever met, were still out cold on a nearby pile of crates. A rueful grin tugged at Charles's lips. He'd pictured many paths to piracy, leading a revolt against the Tianlong garrison, freeing oppressed slaves, even engaging the Royal Navy in open battle, but never this way, never under Rox's coercion, forced into the life by sheer intimidation. He let his eyes drift toward the villages lining the waterfront. Not a single building smoldered, nor a soul lay harmed. The brutal display from last night had spoken loud and leer, dare to resist, and the consequences would be deadly. For now, at least, the townsfolk were safe. Charles rubbed his temple, bracing himself for what came next. Becoming a pirate hadn't been his choice, but survival left him little room to refuse. And with Rox's crew at his back, a new chapter of his life was just beginning. Charles's heart pounded as he turned to Ivan. "Are the townspeople all right? It's my home. If anything happens there." Ivan gave a confident shake of his head. "Don't worry, Charles. A crew of pirates tried to raid the town last night, but they ran straight into a giant with a golden crescent-shaped beard." "A giant with a golden crescent beard?" Charles echoed, eyebrows rising. "That's him," Ivan said, pointing toward the horizon. "Edward Newgate." Charles followed Ivan's finger. There, silhouetted by the pale light of sunrise, stood a colossal ship. On its deck, a broad-shouldered man, beard gleaming like molten gold, leaned against the rail, a half-empty goblet of wine in hand. He watched the sun climb over the sea with the calm assurance of someone who owned every wave. Gathering his courage, Charles strode forward until he stood within earshot. "Sir, thank you for saving my town." Edward Newgate glanced over, his cold gray eyes settling on Charles. He raised one hand in a dismissive wave. "No need to thank me, boy." Charles's gratitude caught in his throat. He opened his mouth to reply, but Newgate's booming laughter cut through the dawn like thunder. Gah! The ship trembled under the force of that laugh. Below deck, pirates who had been dozing sprang to their feet, cursing in surprise. "Damn it, who's making all that noise?" one of them shouted, stumbling up the stairs. Charles watched, uneasy but relieved. His hometown was safe, for now, thanks to the man with the golden crescent beard. Edward Newgate's arrival sent a ripple of tension through the deck. A young pirate steward, paling at the sight of the legendary captain, stammered, "Team, Captain!" "Not now," Newgate replied coldly, ignoring the boy's salutes. The steward swallowed hard and staggered back to his post. Newgate's lips curved into a low chuckle. Heh, morning's still young, why so gloomy? Cheer up, there's better things to do than cower all day." His booming laughter echoed down the gangways. No sooner had he spoken than a second figure drifted into view, the Golden Lion, Shiji, hovering above the main deck like a predatory cat. With a roar of indignation, Shiji lashed out at the flagship's rails. "Don't ever lay a finger on my ship, Newgate." At once, Newgate's giant fist shot forward, cutting off Shiji's advance. The impact alone stirred a gale that flattened flags and snapped wooden planks. Shiji yanked free his pair of dead cherrywood blades, crossing them to absorb the blow. Sparks flared where steel met steel. "Heh! Furious at dawn already? Should I calm you down?" Newgate teased, stepping back to give ground. Shiji bristled, voice dripping gunpowder. "Stand aside, or I'll make you regret it." Below deck, the crews erupted into panicked shouts as they tumbled from bunks and scrambled over each other in their haste to see what was happening topside. "Captain's about to fight, sir," one breathless pirate yelled to his comrades. Outside the harbor, other ships awoke to the commotion, rigging creaking in the sudden wind. "Did you hear? Whitebeard and the Golden Lion, right here, right now." Silence fell for a heartbeat. Then the entire port seemed to roar back to life, anticipation crackling through every hull and spar. The stage was set, two titans ready to collide at the break of day. Run! The lock pirates didn't hesitate. Every crewman knew the power their captain wielded, and they scrambled to their feet and bolted. Charles even seized Ivan's hand and leapt down onto the dock. At that same moment, Locke finally roused himself, blinking in the gray dawn light of the now cold bonfire. "Captain, stop the ship! Why aren't you doing anything?" Charles yelled. Locke rubbed his eyes, still half asleep, then cast Charles a grin. "Let them go," he declared. "There's no rule aboard the Locke that forbids crewmates from testing one another. On my ship, only strength matters." His tone brooked no argument. Charles merely nodded, betraying no surprise. In another life, he had heard countless stories of this pirate crew, how Locke had subjugated every rival in these waters, bending all others to his will. His grand ambition had once been to claim the title of King of the Pirates. Though he had ultimately met his downfall in the Valley of Gods, Locke remained, undisputed, the monarch of this sea. No other crew dared stand against him. Even Roger steered clear of him, setting sail for other waters rather than risk provoking the Rock's pirates. Chapter 22. Harchinos. Charles bristled inwardly at the new rule, but kept his silence. He'd never felt any real loyalty to these pirates. Now that he'd been forced into their ranks, his only goal was to use the opportunity to train and grow stronger. "Since you've been named captain of the 8th Division," Rock said in a low, authoritative tone, "here's the rule. You're free to manage your crew and your ship as you like, but you must turn over X% of all plunder." "Understood." Despite the casual timbre of Rox's voice, Charles felt the order bearing down on him. He straightened, saluted crisply, and replied, "Aye, Captain." Rox gave a satisfied nod and stood. "We'll stay in this port for a day. Make your preparations." Charles called back, In the end, Edward Newgate and the Golden Lion Shiki never drew swords. After a tense moment of eye contact, Shiki simply turned and left the deck first. Edward watched him go, and as the other man disappeared into the gloom, the silence of the ship settled heavily around Newgate. The loneliness he'd tried so hard to drown out washed back over him once more. Chapter X, Setting Sail. When will I have my own family? Edward Newgate murmured, staring into the endless horizon. A restless longing gripped him, one he couldn't quite name. The next morning, Charles arrived at the port flanked by over 100 followers. They were the Wild Wolf Gang, and when they learned their young leader intended to sail as a pirate, every man and woman volunteered their service. Among them were doctors and nurses, navigators and cooks, boatmen and sailors, fighters and even personal maids, more than 100 souls in total, each ready to play a vital role on the high seas. Across the harbor, 10 Rock's pirate ships sat at anchor, freshly resupplied and waiting. At the heart of the lineup was Charles's own ship, the vessel he had spent more than a year building. Its deck gleamed in the early light, ropes coiled with care, and sails furled in anticipation. "Ha! Look at this kid hauling half the clan behind him," Rox jeered, flashing a crooked grin. One of his lieutenants laughed. "What is he, opening a boarding house instead of leading a pirate crew?" Rox merely shrugged. Their taunts meant nothing now that the moment of departure had come. Steering to the quarterdeck, Charles gave the signal. The black flag of Locke unfurled, its skull and crossbones stark against the sky. A thunderous cheer rose from the assembled ships as the wind seized the sails and the anchor chains clanged free. With that roar, the fleet set off. Charles and his motley crew pressed into the boundless ocean, each heartbeat echoing a promise of danger, glory, and the chance to forge their own family upon the waves. Charles stared at the harbor, fading behind the mist, and let out a quiet sigh. He didn't know when he would return home, or if he ever would. Shaking his head, he chastised himself. I'm picking up on everyone else's feelings again. Since awakening his dominating power, Charles found his emotions so easily swayed by those around him that it was becoming a real headache. He hated feeling so helplessly reactive. No wonder, then, that over the last 2 years, he'd saved countless slaves, not because he'd mindlessly absorbed their despair, but because it was the right thing to do. And he didn't regret a single rescue. A man who acts shouldn't look back on what he's done. "Master!" At the sound of Jenny's gentle voice, Charles looked up. She stepped forward and pressed her hand to his forehead, soothing away the tension. He reached out, letting her touch steady his racing thoughts. Over the past year, he'd come to know exactly what each of his 5 attendants felt, no longer mere servants in his eyes, but family. I think I'm going to lie down," Charles murmured, his voice soft. Jenny nodded and guided him toward his quarters. As he walked, the unrest in his mind faded. Tonight, at least, he would rest. Charles yawned and stretched. "Call on me if you need anything," he murmured before drifting off to sleep. All around him, their massive ship creaked as it pressed forward through the open sea. In the distance, 10 even larger warships streaked across the horizon, their sails billowing in the wind. There was no denying it. Charles's vessel was slower and had fallen well behind the main fleet. 3 days of steady sailing later, they sighted their destination, Harchinos, known across the Grand Line as Pirate Island. As soon as the anchor splashed into the water, Golden Lion Shiji leapt ashore, his roaring laugh echoing off the cliffs. "At last! 10 days without a single stop. My sea legs are screaming, but we made it." Behind him, the other senior officers sprang from the deck, followed by the rest of the Rock's pirates. In their rush to break the naval record, they'd bypassed every inhabited isle along the way. Now, they were home at last. Charles climbed down the gangplank, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He paused to take in the sight, jagged stone towers crowned with black flags, bustling marketplaces tucked into sheltered coves, and rows of fortified barracks carved against the rocky hills. "Is this really Pirate Island?" he asked, voice hushed with awe. Golden Lion Shiji swaggered over, his golden mane glinting in the midday sun. "You bet," he said, slapping Charles on the back. "This is our island, our fortress, and it belongs to the Rock's pirates. What do you think? Grand enough for you?" Charles let out a slow breath and nodded. It was nothing like the ramshackle hideouts he'd imagined. Here, every stone wall and every fluttering banner proclaimed the power and pride of their crew, more magnificent than he'd ever dared to hope. "Welcome home," Shiji said, his grin widening. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow we celebrate, and then we plan our next raid." Under Harchinos' shadowed cliffs, Charles felt a surge of excitement. The sea was behind them now. The real adventure was just beginning. I had assumed this place was nothing more than a filthy, lawless island. I never expected it to be so busy or so prosperous, especially compared to my tiny Kame Island. Yes, there were countless sword-wielding pirates swaggering through the streets and slaves barely dressed in rags, but on the whole it was surprisingly decent. "Captain, you're back!" 3 figures hurried up to Rox and the rest of us. Rox's face lit up. "Ha! John, Silver Axe, Wangji, did you finish the job?" John wiped his blade clean on his trousers, a greedy smile curling his lips. "Don't worry, Captain. We've razed their kingdoms to the ground, and we brought back the heads of their kings as proof." "Excellent," Rox chuckled, waving a hand. "As usual, hand over our agreed share to the 7th floor, and anything left is yours to split." John nodded, but if you looked closely, you'd see a flicker of dissatisfaction in his eyes. Yinfu and Wang Ji said nothing. Their heavy armor concealed their faces completely, and Charles could only wonder what lay behind their helmets. Captain John's voice rang out across the parade ground. "I hear we have a new crew member. Where is he? Bring him here." The other officers exchanged smug glances as they searched the line of recruits. One of them leaned close to Charles and sneered, "If your eyes don't work, maybe you should donate them. Help someone who can actually see." Charles's face remained expressionless. He stepped forward until he stood toe-to-toe with John. His voice was cool and steady. "Are you blind, sir?" John studied him, noting Charles's height and the steely glint in his eyes. "Word is you're a swordsman," he said. "But I haven't seen your skill. Do you really think you're worthy to lead the 8th team?" Charles's grip tightened around the hilt of his sword, a flash of challenge in his gaze. "If you doubt me, test me. You'll see whether I'm fit to be captain." A slow smile spread across John's face. "Bold words," he said. "But confidence is one thing. Respect for your seniors is another. I wonder if your mother ever taught you proper manners. Look back through her memories. There's no mother there." John slapped his forehead in exasperation, then turned to Charles with a teasing smile. Chapter 23, John Silver, Axe Straight Clang. The flash of steel rang out as Charles's sword met John Silver's blade. Unable to tolerate John's taunting any longer, Charles had drawn first, and John, ever quick, whipped out the sunset sword from his hip to parry the blow. Yo, getting angry already? Come on, we're partners," John chortled, one hand gripping his flagon, the other steadying his sword. Charles cast a quick glance over the assembled crew. Locke and the others stood frozen, eyes glued to the two of them, not a soul stepping in. Around them, the pirates lounged and whispered among themselves. Charles caught every word. "Isn't that the new 8th Division captain, Rockefeller Charles? They say there's a bounty of, what was it, $1 million on his head, so why is he dueling Boss John?" "Maybe the newbie doesn't show the old man the respect he deserves," one pirate suggested. "Or maybe John just wants to test the kid's mettle," another replied with a grin. A few blasé pirates slouched on sofas, exchanging bored commentary as they watched the clash unfold. Each jibe, each snide remark stoked Charles's fury. He tightened his grip on his sword hilt, knuckles whitening. He could tolerate enough, no more. With eyes blazing, Charles lifted his blade in a crisp salute of defiance. "Enough talk," he growled. "If you want to test me, John, then let's finish this." John flexed his right hand and unleashed a powerful slash. Hey, come on, is that all you've got?" he taunted. Charles sidestepped the blade with ease, barely shifting his weight. John swung again. This time, Charles's aura flared around his sword, the blade humming as it absorbed the blow. "Seriously?" Charles replied with a smirk. Unfazed, John shrugged, hurling the ceramic jug in his left hand toward Charles. With his right, he drew a pistol from his hip and fired. The shot cracked the air, the bullet enveloped in flickering aura. Charles tilted his head, letting the projectile graze his cheek as it whistled past. John's confident grin faded the moment Charles struck back. In one fluid motion, Charles drove his sword forward, releasing a dazzling arc of energy nearly 10 meters long. The strike slammed into John, pinning him in place and cutting off every route of escape. Watching from the sidelines, Silver Axe and Wang Ji exchanged surprised looks. That attack was no ordinary man's technique. Its power and precision ranked at least at the level of a vice admiral. For the first time, John's eyes cleared of arrogance and fell fully into focus. He was finally taking Charles seriously. Charles's rapier shot up in his right hand, meeting John's downward slash head-on. The impact reverberated along the blade, but Charles held his ground. "Not bad, blocked," he called, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "Now, try this." John's eyes narrowed. He gathered a crackling sheath of sword energy around his blade that stretched visibly almost 30 meters to either side. Every pirate on the island froze, staring in disbelief. No one dared believe someone was brazen enough to attack the Lock Pirate's own stronghold, yet here it was, a wave of power sweeping toward them all. Without a word, Charles braced himself and unleashed his own sword aura, a brilliant arc of white light equal in length to John's. The two arcs collided with a thunderous boom. John's crimson slash splintered apart, dispersing in a spray of sparks. Charles's white arc drove on, halting just 2 meters from John before dissolving into the air. Charles raised an eyebrow. "Impressive," he said lightly, "but not enough to beat me. You've got guts, I'll give you that. I'm actually starting to enjoy this." John's expression darkened. He flexed his muscles, then reached back to his belt and drew a pistol in one hand and a dagger in the other. He adopted a low, guarded stance. Charles lifted his rapier again, ready to press the advantage. Suddenly, John growled, "Stop right there! Charles, there's no need to have your crew all stiff and serious." In the blink of an eye, Locke appeared behind Charles and slapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. A cold sweat broke out on Charles's back. Locke had moved that fast. Recovering his composure, Charles forced a grin, sheathed his sword, and let his hard glare vanish. "Relax, I was only joking," he said warmly to Liu Lux. The pirates stared in disbelief. One moment Charles had looked ready to kill, the next he was beaming. Nobody wanted to provoke the captain of the 8th crew, least of all John, who quietly lowered his weapon once he gauged Charles's power. With the tension gone, the others gathered closer, chattering excitedly. "Ha! That was perfect, Charles," crowed the golden lion Shiji as he floated over, a glowing cigar dangling from his jaws. "I've been tired of John swooping in to claim all the loot, especially when he barely breaks a sweat." The sudden shift in mood, from near bloodshed to laughter, sent ripples of relief through the deck. Charles exchanged satisfied glances with Locke and Liu Lux, knowing he just reminded everyone who really held the reins on this ship. Charles glanced around as the murmurs of discontent swelled. Every time John swooped in on the battlefield, he made off with all the treasure, and by the end of the fighting, there was nothing left for anyone else. The men were furious. Even Edward Newgate, usually calm and generous, shook his head. "I don't even have enough coin left to buy a slice of cake," he muttered. Charles cleared his throat and spoke up, his tone measured but firm. The crowd turned to him, hoping for some relief. But John merely lifted his goblet, took a leisurely sip of wine, and leaned back in his chair. Clutching the haft of his massive silver axe, he looked directly at the king and asked, "Your Majesty, what exactly do they mean to each other?" Charles pointed toward the 3 men seated at the far end of the table. Those 3 were Locke's very first recruits, long before any of us joined his banner. They're the ones he trusts above all others. John here, he nodded toward the axe-wielder, might not be the greatest in a fair fight, but he manages the Rock's pirates' coffers with meticulous care. The man with the silver axe and Wang Shi are both renowned swordsmen, though their heyday may be behind them. No one knows whether their blades still sing with the old strength. At that, the golden lion unleashed a smoky chuckle, flicking ash from his cigar. His gaze swept over the trio with unmistakable disdain. The tension in the hall crackled like charged powder. Every pirate, every officer, and even the king himself felt the ripple of unease as the question of loyalty and worth hung heavy in the air. Charles fell in step behind the golden lion Shiji, Edward Newgate, and the other new recruits. Naturally, they'd all been rejected by John's silver axe and the old faction. Now 2 camps faced off, Shiji's rising faction of outcasts and Silver Axe's entrenched veterans, each side bristling with mutual contempt. Charles glanced at Shiji and ventured, "Brother Shiji, if you squared off against John Silver Axe and the old man leading the veterans, who'd come out on top?" Shiji turned, eyes cold with disdain. "If it were a real fight to the death, I'd have both of them under my blade by nightfall. They wouldn't even have time to dig graves." That supreme confidence made Charles's blood pound. He clenched his fist, imagining the day when he'd be strong enough to feel that same unshakable certainty. Shaking off the thought, Charles followed Shiji and the others into the hall. As the newest initiate, he stood loyally beside their leader. No respect yet, but at least it would give pause to anyone who might underestimate him. 8 figures crossed the threshold into a vast chamber. Gigantic pillars sculpted like roaring lions lined the walls, and golden reliefs caught the flicker of torchlight. The air hummed with tension, 2 rival powers now locked in a silent standoff, each waiting for the first move. In the center of the cavernous chamber stood a massive throne, and behind it stretched an enormous sea chart. Charles leaned forward, studying it intently. This was a detailed map of the second half of the Grand Line, clearly marking out the current strength and territorial reach of the Rock's pirates. Without a moment's hesitation, Shibek strode forward and settled onto the throne. One by one, his 7 lieutenants filed in and took their places around the Great Hall, each seated according to the rank and division they commanded. Chapter 24. The naval fleet attacks Rocks stood in the dimly lit war room, arms folded, eyes scanning his officers. "Where are Heitan Muchen and Heitan Chanwan? They were supposed to be back hours ago." Golden Lion shifted in his seat, exchanging uneasy glances with the others. He cleared his throat and forced a laugh. "Them. We never heard a thing. Thought they'd radio in if anything went wrong." John leaned against the table, swirling his wine in slow circles. He took a measured sip and shrugged, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "They usually check in. Maybe they got held up." Rox's jaw tightened. "Lox, bring up the bug, now." Lox snapped open the covert comm device. "Bolu? Boru? Boru?" A tense silence rolled in for a heartbeat before a panicked voice crackled through. "Captain Rox, this is Heitan Muchen. The Navy's here. Admiral Cyborg Sora himself has led a fleet into the New World waters. We're under heavy fire." Rox pounded his fist against the table. "Which sea area?" Behind the static, the roar of distant cannons answered. "Ira Zell sector. Admiral Cyborg Kong's squadron is chasing us. We're pinned down, requesting immediate backup." The line cut off abruptly, leaving only the hum of the room's lights. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of that single call for help settled on them all. The Navy had breached their territory, their outposts were under siege, and their comrades were trapped without reinforcements. At last, Rox lifted his head, determination hardening his features. "Prepare every ship we've got. We're going in. No one's left behind." Rox threw back his head and howled. "Target the waters around Irazell and teach the Navy whose sea this really is." "Sir," the 7 lieutenants roared in unison. Rox vaulted down from his throne, his officers fanning out behind him. "All hands, fall in. We set our sights on Irazell." Striding onto the island's vast viewing platform, he banged his fist against the railing. "Make sure every Navy vessel within sight knows this territory belongs to us." At once, the assembled pirates sprang into action, shouting orders and scrambling toward the shore. Rox turned to the towering figure beside him. "Shiji, I'll need your fluttering fruit power for this assault." "No problem, Captain," growled the Golden Lion Shiji, cigar clamped between his teeth. Charles watched in stunned fascination. Only now did he grasp the full extent of Shiji's devil fruit ability, the power to make any inanimate object drift skyward and obey his will, as if gravity itself bent to him. The pirate's mobilization was astonishingly swift, far faster than Charles had dared imagine. On the deck of a looming warship, Shiji tapped his boot against the timbers. With a subtle gesture, dozens of pirates rose off the planks, hovering like kites caught in an updraft. Charles clenched his fists, excitement and dread warring in his chest. The assault on Irazell was about to begin, and with Shiji's power in play, it would be a spectacle the Navy wouldn't soon forget. Charles rocked on his feet until he found his balance. Gazing out, he realized the ship was floating several hundred meters above the open sea, clouds brushing against its hull. He couldn't help but marvel at the wonders of the pirate world. A sudden thought flashed through his mind. Maybe it was time he ate a devil fruit of his own. Two, in particular, had caught Charles's eye. The first was the bat fruit, model phantom beast, vampire, said to be hidden somewhere in sleeping ancient town in the New World. The second was the thunder fruit, rumored to lie on Bika Island in Skypiea. Neither had an owner, and both were famed for their staggering power and boundless potential. He vowed that, given the chance, he would claim them both, though he knew retrieving the thunder fruit would be especially tricky, since it was tucked away high in the sky. He stole a glance at his companion, the golden lion Shiji, who hovered nearby. Perhaps Shiji's own flight ability would come in handy. Meaning, highly, the ship pressed on, slicing through the sky at a steady clip. They soon entered the Ira-Zel Sea region, not far from their home island of Huchinos. After 2 or 3 hours, a sudden roar cut the air from nearly 300 meters below, the unmistakable thunder of cannon fire. Every crew member leaned over the railing, peering down at the tumult far beneath them. Charles peered through the misty dawn light and saw them, 10 marine warships pounding cannon fire into a squadron flying the infamous black banner of the Rock's pirates. That skull and crossbones flag meant only one thing. These were no ordinary outlaws. "Drop anchor!" Rox Djibek's voice boomed across the deck of the flagship Golden Lion. At his order, Captain Shiji seized the wheel and brought the ship to a juddering halt. High in the crow's nest of the nearest marine vessel, a lookout snapped to attention. Reporting to Cyborg General Kong Hui, "I've confirmed it. The Rock's pirates are here, led by Rox Djibek." General Kong Hui, better known among the Marines as Cyborg Kong, snatched up a pair of binoculars and trained them on the distant horizon. There, through the haze, he made out Rox Djibek's crimson coat and 7 of the pirate captain's officers pacing the flushing deck of the Golden Lion. "Brother Sora," exclaimed Vice Admiral Garp, rubbing his hands in anticipation. "Let's finish these pirates off before they can even think of running." "Quiet, Garp," Fleet Admiral Sengoku scolded, clapping a hand over Garp's mouth. "Not so loud in front of your superior." Cyborg Kong lowered the binoculars, his mechanical shades gleaming. He counted 10 warships arrayed under his command, and 10 against. Yet in his flagship's mess stood not only Sengoku and Garp, but 5 elite lieutenant generals personally dispatched from headquarters. The admiral let a faint grin cross his lips. With that kind of firepower at their backs, how could the Rock's pirates hope to escape unscathed? Charles felt his heart pound as both armadas braced for the clash that would decide the fate of these waters. Steelbone Kong's cybernetic eyes flashed with fierce determination. "Attack the Rock's pirates! Justice will prevail!" he thundered, the command rippling through every channel of the naval fleet. "Justice shall prevail!" The sailors roared back in unison. Aboard a nearby ship, more than 1,000 meters away, Charles heard their rallying cry and allowed himself a brief, confident smile. "All right," he murmured. "Let's move out." On the pirate side, Rox let out a deafening roar that set every soul trembling with battle lust. Swords were drawn, flintlocks cocked, and even the 7 lieutenants unleashed their weapons. Hayton Muchin's battered vessel, still smoldering from the previous bombardment, creaked back into formation. Then Rox himself bellowed the signal, Big Buddha Shockwave. At just a few hundred meters distance, the marine warships completed their mysterious animalization process, transforming into colossal golden Buddhas. In a blinding flash, an immense shockwave surged forth, hurtling straight at the pirate armada. But the Rock's pirates refused to waver. Their hearty laughter rose above the turbulence. "Gwa-ha-ha-ha-ha!" as they steadied their lines for the impact. Boom, boom, boom. Through the tumult, a lone figure descended from the clouds and strode onto the bow of the flagship. It was Edward Newgate, the legendary Whitebeard. With a thunderous clash, he planted his massive bicento firmly into the deck, tossed his cloak aside, and raised his colossal fist skyward. A slight, knowing curve flickered beneath his golden beard as he prepared to answer the Marine's challenge. "Empty shock!" With a thunderous roar, Edward Newgate's massive fist collided with the incoming shockwave. The very air around his punch seemed to shatter, fracturing into jagged layers of space. The assaulting force died on the spot. "Don't dare barge in unannounced." Whitebeard's lips curved into a grim smile. His hand closed as though crushing the atmosphere itself. Sea quake! Veins bulged at his temples as he drew both arms back, every muscle pulsing with power. Then, with a savage pull, he drove his fists downward. In an instant, the placid sea split in two. Towering walls of water erupted, smashing into the 10 marine warships like a tidal hammer. Chaos reigned aboard the fleet. Sailors screamed as decks pitched violently, railings snapped, and rigging whipped in the wind. Even the admirals stationed on the flagship stared in horror at the watery cataclysm unfolding before them. "Hold on. Don't let go of the deck, or you'll be overboard," Cyborg Sora shouted, her mechanical arm latching onto the rail with uncanny strength. Nearby, Warring States gripped the mast so tightly his knuckles turned white. As devil fruit users, both knew all too well that a single fall into the raging sea would mean doom. "Damn rocks pirates!" Admiral Sengoku bellowed, his eyes fixed on the looming silhouette of Whitebeard's ship through the haze of salt spray. With a grave expression, Garp braced himself by clenching the handrail to keep from toppling over. And it wasn't only the Marines who were taken aback. Even the fearsome rocks pirates stood in stunned silence, every one of them staring up at Edward Newgate. Chapter 25. The Great Naval Retrenchment. A bracing salt wind whipped across the deck of the rocks pirates' flagship, snapping sails and rattling rigging. Below, the Imperial Navy's warships formed an iron crescent, their cannons trained on the pirate armada. At their head stood Admiral Locks, his blade glinting in the dawn light. Charles, barely 16, eyes wide with both fear and excitement, hovered near the railing, clutching the rail as his heart pounded. He'd heard whispers of Edward Newgate's titanic power, but nothing could have prepared him for this. Admiral Locks raised his sword, voice booming over the roar of the sea. "Rocks, you insolent dogs, surrender or die!" Laughter rippled through the pirate ranks. At the stern, their captain, Rocks D. Zebek, leaned casually against the rail, a cruel grin split across his face. "Die? Not today, Admiral! Attack!" At his command, pirate cannon thundered in reply. The Navy ships returned fire. Iron balls tore through sails, splintering wood, screaming across the water. 10 warships surged forward, aiming to break the pirate line and capture Rocks himself. Locks met them head-on, blades flashing, Marines spilling across deck planks. For a moment, it looked as if the Navy might prevail. Then came the tremor. It began deep within the hull of Rox's flagship, a low rumble that shook every board. The sea itself seemed to quiver. Charles staggered, eyes darting across the deck, searching for the source, and then he saw him. Whitebeard. Edward Newgate rose from the center of the deck like a war god. His great white mustache bristled, his broad shoulders braced for impact. With one mighty stomp, he planted his foot on the timbers, and the world shattered. A jagged shockwave ripped through the water, splintering wood and hurling sailors in all directions. The 10 assaulting warships buckled like paper dolls, masts snapped, hulls cracked, decks split open. Cannon, men, and sea churned together in a roiling maelstrom of spray and debris. For a heartbeat, the sea lay silent. Then the pirates roared, their cries bouncing off every mast and sail. "Whitebeard! Whitebeard! Whitebeard!" Charles's legs went weak. He sank to one knee, staring in awe at the devastation. Everything he'd heard about the world's strongest man seemed an understatement now. Newgate stood at the bow, fists on hips, booming laughter echoing over the waves. Admiral Locks, bruised and battered, staggered back to his feet aboard what remained of his flagship. His knuckles whitened on his sword hilt as he met Newgate's gaze. Fear flickered across his eyes, raw, unhidden. He had come to crush pirates, only to find himself crushed. Rocks D. Zebek strode forward, clapping slowly. "Remarkable, Whitebeard. Once again you surpass even my expectations." Newgate bowed politely. "I'm honored, Captain. But truly, these ships posed no real challenge to me." Rocks turned to his assembled crews, voice rising above the continued cheers. "Brothers, the Navy has felt our strength. Now, pursue the Admiral's flagship. Today, we spill Imperial blood in vengeance for every comrade they've slain." A renewed roar swept through the armada. Charles scrambled to his feet, heart racing at the promise of the coming battle. All around him, the pirates readied boarding hooks and boarding axes, their faces alight with feral glee. The day's true slaughter was only just beginning, and at its center stood Whitebeard, shaking the very seas with his laughter. Zebek sprang onto the prow and bellowed at the retreating naval squadron. Kill the general. Bring him down. A roar of approval rose from the pirate fleet. 10 vessels instantly veered to pursue the fleeing warships, their black sails snapping in the wind. Aboard the lead warship, Steelbones Kongson, one of Navy headquarters' top cyborg officers, leaned against the rail, blood seeping through his damaged plating. He ground out a curse. These were the Navy's finest, and now they were being hunted by pirates. "General Kongson, fall back!" Admiral Warring States shouted, bracing himself against the mast. He glanced anxiously at the onrushing pirate armada. Cyborg Sora tightened his mechanical fist, sparks flickering at his knuckles. "Retreat! Get clear of these waters!" Kongson let out a frustrated roar and waved his arm. A messenger blew the warning horn with every ounce of his lungs. Toot! With that long, quavering blast, the 10 warships and their support vessels trimmed their sails and began a fighting withdrawal. The Rocks pirates erupted in celebration. Long live Rocks! The Rocks pirates reigned supreme. Attention all stations. The Grand Fleet has been driven back at the entrance to the New World. Admiral Cyborg Kong's metallic frame towered over the briefing table as he barked his orders. Fall back to Navy headquarters in the New World and strip away every informal title, effective immediately. He slammed his steel fist against the table. Wood and metal exploded outward. The Lock Pirates have declared all-out war on the world government. I want coordinated strikes on every allied nation. Word of the Navy's disastrous defeat spread like wildfire. Street criers and newspaper hawkers flooded every port, proclaiming that the world government's forces had been routed. Admiral Kong crumpled the latest dispatch in his hand, his eyes burning with fury. Damn Lock, and damn the Lock Pirates! Since their forced evacuation from the latter half of the Grand Line, Captain Locke and his crew had been on the offensive, systematically targeting member states of the world government. 3 newly allied countries had already been obliterated in the past week alone. Brother Kong, Captain Cap spoke up, rising from his seat. We have to establish a foothold here in the New World. Without a strong base, we can't hope to mount a counterattack. Admiral Kong drew a deep, mechanical breath and glared at the scattered wreckage of the table. The second half of the Grand Line was now virtually pirate territory, save for a handful of critical naval outposts clustered around the Red Earth continent. It was time to reclaim the initiative, or face total collapse. The second half of the Grand Line, where the world's most fearsome pirates reign, had long since been dubbed the New World. In the wake of the Navy's disastrous losses during the Rocks Pirates' onslaught, Fleet Headquarters was forced to pull nearly all its forces back to the Red Earth continent. Beyond that narrow staging ground, the entire New World lay open to piracy. Admiral Cyborg Kong slammed his metal fist against the command table. No more excuses. Because of our setback, pirates are running rampant on every sea. Now it's up to you to turn the tide. You, Admiral Crane, will take charge of the East China Sea. During the Warring States campaign, you quelled the South China Sea. Now I want you to reclaim the East. As for Zifa, he's been dispatched to Western seas, and the northern seas are choking with pirate activity. Crane, split your forces, secure the first half of the Grand Line, and wipe out every last pirate you find. The command came straight from the world government. It had been months since the Rocks pirates had devastated marine positions in the New World, and opportunistic bands of marauders were pouring into every shipping lane. The Admiral's counterorders were as desperate as they were dire: reclaim lost ground, or watch the seas fall entirely into pirate hands. Meanwhile, in the squalid pirate port of Coral Cove, a horn-crested brigand raised his battered musket high. All right, lads, set sail for the Grand Line. The New World is ours for the taking. 1,000 voices echoed his cry. Grand Line, New World. Far to the west, aboard the rusting deck of the brig Crimson Howl, a 3-meter-tall pirate with a traffic cone helmet roared with laughter. Ha! The Navy thinks they can stop us? We'll show them what real power looks like in the New World. Below them, crews of every stripe, rogues, buccaneers, ex-marines turned cutthroats, all prepared to storm the unexplored seas. The HOF Pirates was in full swing, and the New World beckoned with the promise of untold riches and unimaginable danger. Captain, a thunderous chant rippled across the deck. But this was no ragtag mob of cutthroats. Each pirate wore a crisp uniform, stood in precise ranks. They looked more like soldiers than freebooters. "Captain, sir, Zifa's fleet is bearing down on us." Lieutenant Milan, clad in an olive-green greatcoat, came sprinting to the helm. Rox D, Jibek's scarred face twisted with anger. "Zifa? Damn that navy!" He slammed a gauntleted fist against the steering wheel. "Let them see what happens when they mess with coneheads." All around them, the seas were in revolt. From the East China Sea to the North Blue, every port was bursting with would-be buccaneers, clambering onto rickety sloops, clutching nothing but a plank of driftwood. "Ha!" They laughed, eager to taste infamy. Golden Lion Shiji stepped forward, handing Rox a water-stained newspaper. "Captain, our reputation has exploded. Pirates everywhere are lining up to join our banner. Shall I enlist them all?" Rox scanned the headline in grim satisfaction. Rox D. Jibek, bounty, 20 billion berries. Crimes against humanity, most wanted. With a fierce grin, he crumpled the paper in his massive hand. "Recruit every last one. Arm each squad to the teeth. We won't just carve our names into the Grand Line. We'll conquer it. We'll be world kings." His roar shattered the afternoon calm. The 8 commanders around him stood taller, hearts ablaze with his ambition. "Yes, sir! Right away, Captain!" they bellowed in unison. Golden Lion Shiji laughed, the fire of conquest shining bright in his eyes. The die was cast. Under Rox D. Jibek's banner, the world would tremble. Charles sat at the end of the line of division commanders, the wanted poster clutched tightly in his hand. His young features were streaked with blood, and around him lay the bodies of countless defeated foes. Despite the carnage at his feet, a nervous smile flickered on his lips. Blood Sword Lord Rockefeller Charles, captain of the Rocks, Pirates 8th Division, now carried a staggering bounty of 9 billion berries. The price on his head had soared ever higher after he followed Captain Rox in raising several allied nations. Live or die, the message was clear. "Let's move out," Captain Rox announced, rising to his full height. "We're here to recruit. Let's see if any of these rogues have what it takes to serve under us." One by one, the other division chiefs fell into step behind him. Only Golden Lion Shiji and John shared their captain's keen interest in new talent. The rest appeared indifferent. With a powerful shove, they pushed open the fortress gates and strode into the clamoring streets of Huchino's island. Pirates of every shape and size filled the thoroughfares, their shouts swelling in volume as they caught sight of the legendary crew. "Captain Rox!" they bellowed in unison, eager to prove themselves worthy of a place among the feared and now ever more notorious Rox pirates. Chapter 26. Recruitment. A roar of thunder shook the courtyard as thousands of pirates pressed in around the gates. At the center stood Rox, his booming laughter echoing off the stone walls. "Waha! You scurvy curs want to join the Rox pirates?" he called out, arms spread wide. "Very well, only the last 800 standing get a berth on this ship." Behind him, Golden Lion clamped a cigar between his teeth, smoke curling lazily into the air. He watched approvingly as his captain's decree settled over the crowd. "Only the strong may enter our ranks," he murmured, exhaling a plume of gray. "The weak have no place here." For a heartbeat, the assembled pirates stared at one another in stunned silence. Then a wave of tension rippled through the masses. Bloodshot eyes darted, fists clenched at belts bristling with blades. A low growl rose, building into a deafening war cry. In a single instant, hundreds of swords slid free of scabbards. Pirates slashed at their neighbors, forging trust into carnage. Steel rang on steel as the courtyard was transformed into a whirlwind of flying limbs and flashing blades. Dust billowed, mingling with cries of pain and triumph. The ruthless contest had begun, and only the fiercest 800 would survive this trial by blood. Rox surveyed the arena with calm authority, flanked by his lieutenants, each one a study in contrasts. Edward Newgate's snowy white beard gave him the air of a stern patriarch, while Shiki, the Golden Lion, roared with boisterous laughter. Charles Lingling sat nonchalantly on a folding stool, nibbling cake as though he were at an afternoon tea rather than in the presence of some of the world's deadliest pirates. Silver Axe Wang Ji stood motionless in his polished armor. His face was hidden, but the weight of his stare was unmistakable. Off to one side, John leaned back in his chair, a glass of wine in hand, watching the combat below with the detached amusement of a spectator at the theater. Charles happened to glance in John's direction, and caught him smiling. Embarrassed, he looked away, and John simply arched an eyebrow before returning his attention to the clashes on the sand. Nearby, Heitan Muchan and his younger brother trembled so badly they could barely stand, both wondering just how they'd managed to earn a place among Rox's elite. Down in the arena, Rox's eyes never wavered from the fighters. Charles turned to watch as well, noting that many contenders displayed fearsome devil fruit abilities, particularly those with animal transformations, but genuine swordsmen were few and far between. Most wielded blades with brutish strength rather than finesse, smashing their opponents with raw power. Charles snorted in mild contempt. Not a single combatant among them had yet shown the skill or poise he expected from Rox's cadre. He leaned back, still unpersuaded that any of these pirates could truly match his standards. Charles stood at the edge of the arena, his heart thundering in his chest. Captain Lox had ordered him to observe, so all he could do was watch as wave after wave of newcomers fought for their lives. 3 grueling hours passed before the final duel ended. "Stop!" Locke's roar shattered the last clash of steel. An almost palpable force rolled outward from him, pressing down on every pirate still on their feet. Slowly, weapons lowered and breath steadied. Locke threw back his head and laughed, a rich, triumphant sound. "Ha! Congratulations to all of you who have passed the final test, and congratulations to the Locke's pirates for gaining such fierce recruits." At his words, relief and joy broke loose. Survivors who'd been locked in desperate combat moments before embraced one another, tears mixed with sweat on their faces. Some fell to their knees, shaking, offering silent thanks that they'd lived to see the end of the trial. "Rocks!" one newcomer cried. "Locks! Rocks!" another shouted, and soon the entire group was chanting their leaders' names in celebration. Locks let the cheering wash over him, his chest swelling with pride. He surveyed the group, strong, determined faces, each survivor forged by hardship. For a long moment, the scene held nothing but victory and camaraderie. Then Locke's grin faded. He stepped forward, silencing the crowd with a single, cool glance. "Tell me," he called, his voice carrying to every corner of the arena, "who among you wants to become an officer of the Locke's pirates?" A stunned hush fell. The 8 officers standing behind Locke exchanged surprised glances. Even the hardened survivors, still catching their breath, found themselves holding it, waiting for Locke to speak again. In that charged silence, every pair of eyes turned to him, dreaming of the promotion that could change their lives forever. Countless pirates stared up at Rox with greedy anticipation. "If you want to become a cadre," he announced, a slow smile spreading across his face as he surveyed the more than 800 men below, "you'll have to defeat these veteran cadres, banish them, or even take their places." At Rox's words, a murmur ran through the crowd. Every ambitious pirate fixed his gaze on the 8 cadres who now stood behind him. In perfect unison, those 8 stepped forward, forming a line at Rox's back. In the center towered the white-bearded Edward Newgate. Silent and immovable, he gripped his colossal great knife. The sheer weight of his presence pressed down on every pirate. At 6 meters tall, he literally loomed over the entire field. Beside him, the golden lion Shiki drew on his pipe, smoke curling around his shoulders as he swept the spectators with a sly, sinister grin. But it was Charles Lingling who drew the most curious stares. Seated at the front, he calmly ate a slice of cake, one hand never leaving the plate. In this band of ruthless sea rovers, a man in gleaming armor nonchalantly snacking on dessert was an astonishing sight. Rumor had long since traveled. This was the boy who, at only 5 years old, had razed the giant village to the ground. Clad in polished armor and clutching his formidable silver axe, Charles exuded power. No one dared challenge him. John lifted a goblet of red wine in one hand, his Western-style sword resting at his hip, and surveyed the low-level pirates below with thinly disguised contempt. The 2 siblings, Heitan and Muchan, also felt the weight of hungry gazes, but it was Charles Rockefeller who attracted the most covetous stares. Every pair of eyes in the room glinted with anticipation at the thought of besting him. Before Locke could call the room to order, Charles sprang to his feet. "Anyone brave enough to test themselves, step forward now," he challenged. "There won't be a second chance." Charles advanced into the open space at the center of the deck, his expression flat but unyielding. At his side, Rox, the hulking bouncer whose reputation was as solid as the stones he was named for, lifted an eyebrow and shrugged. "So," he rumbled, "who dares to face the bloodsword hero, Captain Charles Rockefeller of the 8th Division, Rock Pirates?" With that provocation, more than 40 pirate hopefuls surged forward, eager to earn their place in infamy. Lox frowned in disappointment. "Is that really all of you? Don't waste time. Step up." Rox scanned the assembled crowd once more, then let out a throaty laugh. At his signal, another 20 rough-and-tumble rogues clambered over the railing to join the fray. "Very well," Rox boomed. "Let the challenges begin." With a collective roar, over 60 pirates lunged at Charles Rockefeller, each determined to carve their name into pirate legend by taking down the bloodsword hero. Charles looked down at the ragtag band of pirates, axes gleaming, pistols at the ready, and felt nothing but contempt. With a single, fluid motion, he drew the longsword from his hip. Its blade shimmered in the sunlight, far more exquisite than the crude sword he'd once wielded. He'd claimed this treasure from a royal armory when he single-handedly toppled those kingdoms that dared side with the world government. Suddenly, 3 sharp cracks split the air. Bullets hurtled toward him in rapid succession. Charles didn't even bother to lift his gaze. He merely tilted his head, and the shots whizzed harmlessly past, as if fired at thin air. To a warrior of his caliber, such ordinary firearms might as well have been toy pop guns. Now it was his turn. Charles inhaled deeply, summoning the raw power that had surged through him during recent skirmishes. He belonged among the top 5 fighters in all of the Rock's pirates, second only to Rox himself, Whitebeard, Golden Lion, and the formidable Charles Lingling. Even they were the only ones who gave him pause. With a fierce cry, he unleashed a 40-meter arc of sword aura so bright and razor-sharp it cleaved through the rushing pirates like a scythe through wheat. Screams of terror erupted as one by one they were overwhelmed by the blinding white arc. When the light faded, not a single attacker remained standing. Charles sheathed his blade and surveyed the carnage with cool satisfaction. "Who's next?" he asked, voice echoing over the deck. Silence answered him. The battle, for now, was his alone. "Alas, every challenger has fallen. It's truly tragic," Rox said, feigning sorrow. "Why would Charles do this?" "They were all our allies," he added, his voice dripping with mock grief. Chapter 27. Pregnancy. Charles rolled his eyes in exasperation. What had gotten into his captain lately? He'd been acting like a spoiled child. When Charles continued to ignore him, Rox D. Gibbek simply shrugged and scanned the assembled pirates, over 700 of them, spread out before him. "Anyone else want to challenge me?" he called. At once dozens of pirates backed away, fear etched on their faces. If the captain of the 8th Division alone was so formidable, then what horrors must the other 7 division commanders unleash? The very thought sent a shiver through the crowd. Suddenly a hearty laugh rang out. "All right then, I'll take you on." Rox threw his arms wide and addressed the onlookers with a triumphant grin. "Long live Captain Locke." The roar of approval was deafening, and he basked in every shout and cheer. After a moment, he raised his voice again. "Very well, now choose whichever division you wish to serve." At that, Shiji the Golden Lion could no longer contain himself. He hovered in midair, blonde hair fluttering and cigar clenched between his teeth, and laughed uproariously. "Ha! Join my Sky Fleet, and I guarantee you'll get anything you desire. Ha!" The promise stirred the crowd. Pirates' eyes gleamed as they stared at Shiji, already imagining the glories that awaited them in the skies. The roar rose in a single, thunderous wave. "Long live Boss Ski! Long live Boss Ski!" More than 700 voices joined the chant, at least a third of the crowd bellowing in unison. Captain Shiji, known far and wide as the Golden Lion, savored the triumphant uproar. In moments, nearly 300 eager souls had pledged their swords to his Golden Lion fleet. But before the cheering died away, another voice cracked through the tumult with its own promise of riches. "Yo-ha! I'm John! Craving treasure? Then sail under my banner. Untold wealth awaits you." John's boast was irresistible. From the 400 or so people still undecided, nearly 200 stamped forward to join his crew. Among them, Chi-Chi stepped proudly into John's line. Seeing 2 flotillas drawn so swiftly, the remaining onlookers surged to cast their lot with the next rising stars. Chief among them was Edward Newgate, Whitebeard himself, whose immense stature and flowing white beard seemed almost mythic. With a booming laugh, "Goo-ha-ha!" he welcomed over 200 new recruits into Whitebeard's command. At last, only a handful were left. They divided themselves between Wang Ji Yinfu and Hayton Muchan, hoping for fortune under their black flags. But two figures, Charles Lingling and the boy known from tales as the Bloodsword Master, stood apart, unclaimed. A handful of hesitant sailors approached Charles, begging to join his crew, but he shook his head with quiet firmness. He had chosen this path alone. In less than an hour, the dust had settled. Captain Golden Lion Shiji commanded 300 men, John's treasure seekers numbered 200, Whitebeard another 200 strong, and the rest scattered among lesser captains. Yet Charles Lingling remained an island unto himself, his fate still unwritten, his destiny his alone to claim. Charles watched from a distance as the captains he'd approached one by one turned him down and joined forces with Yin Fu and Wang Jina. Golden Lion Shiji, spotting Charles standing all alone, threw back his head and laughed. "Ha ha ha! Kid, looks like you've got nobody to back you up. Want me to lend you a few friends? Ha ha!" Charles rolled his eyes, turned his back, and walked away, leaving Golden Lion Shiji guffawing in the clearing. "That kid's got a lot of nerve," Shiji muttered, shaking his head. Then he swept his gaze over the nearly 300 pirates at his command and let out another hearty laugh. "All right, boys, come on over. I've got the gear ready for you." With a swagger, Shiji hovered into the air and his pirates clamored after him. "Boss Shiji, we're right behind you." Unfazed, Charles made his way back to his own ship. The proud E, emblem of the 8th Division, hung above the gangplank. Under that banner, no one dared cause trouble. As he reached the deck, his first mate, Gong Yifan, led the sailors forward. "Captain, you're back!" "Good to see everyone," Charles replied, stepping aboard. He looked around. Only a handful of men were sweeping and mopping the deck. One of them hesitated, then spoke up in an uneasy voice. "Captain, we've never destroyed a country before. Now that we've earned enough, we're all heading to the island for some fun," the sailor announced cheerfully. Charles nodded and stepped into the cabin. "Master!" Immediately, every maid lining the corridor dipped into a deep curtsy at his entrance. Charles met their greeting with a neutral expression. These women had all been slaves he'd liberated. Now they served aboard his ship. He felt no burden in granting them refuge. Without him, they would have been scattered across the world, sold to corrupt nobles or ruthless merchants. Each was strikingly beautiful, and he sometimes marveled that they chose to follow him. All he'd promised was a meal and a safe place to stay, yet to them that promise was a gift beyond measure. "Master!" Jenny called, appearing with 4 younger girls trailing behind her. Charles smiled and nodded in greeting, then gave Jenny a gentle hug. She turned bright red, and the other 4 maids blushed shyly in response. Life at sea could be dull. Apart from daily training, Charles's favorite diversion was playing simple games with his maids. "All right, everyone," he said, clapping his hands once. "Let's enjoy ourselves before we reach the island. Return to your quarters." Charles stormed into the cabin, still cradling Jenny in his arms. "Master, no!" Jenny gasped, wrenching free from his grasp. He halted, brows knitting together. Alarmed by his stern gaze, Jenny blurted out, "Master, I'm pregnant." Charles's eyes went wide. "Pregnant? Pregnant?" he echoed, struggle evident in his voice. Gently setting her on her feet, he asked again, "When did this happen?" Jenny's lip trembled. "Today. I went to the ship's doctor. He confirmed it. We didn't take any precautions. I never expected it would happen so soon." She dared not meet his eyes. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then Charles reached out, lifted her chin, and their eyes locked. He pressed a soft kiss to her temple, as if to soothe her fears. Drawing her close once more, he murmured, his tone strikingly gentle, "Since you're carrying my child, we'll face this together." In the corner, the 4 other maids watched with envious hearts. None of them had been so blessed. Charles cradled Jenny in his arms, still marveling that he'd become a father, especially at 15. Even more astonishing was Jenny herself, barely 15 or 16. It had been 3 years since his previous life, yet this was his very first child. His heart swelled with pride. There was no greater honor than passing on one's bloodline. He'd adopted a new identity, but to all who met him, he remained unmistakably foreign, 2 meters tall, with pale skin and flaxen hair. In high spirits, Charles set off for the bedroom, gently swaying Jenny as he went. Behind him followed Martha's 4 daughters, chattering like excited sparrows. Tonight, as every night, they would all share the same chamber. Not to mention Mary, already dancing and laughing aboard Charles's ship, fueling the island's revelry. All across Hachinos Island, lanterns bobbed in the breeze, laughter rang out from every dock and tavern, and music pulsed in the night air. "Where's Charles?" Locke muttered, scanning the throng of celebrants. "Has anyone seen him?" The Golden Lion Shiji let out a low, mirthless chuckle. Probably off amusing himself with his little maids. He replied, his grin twisting into something faintly predatory. Chapter 28, Heavenly Gold. "Ha! I never pegged that kid as such a pervert," Rox chuckled, slapping his thigh. Laughter rippled around the table. "Captain Locks," another pirate piped up between guffaws, "that boy isn't ordinary. He's got at least 20 young, beautiful women aboard his ship, each one prettier than the last. I can't imagine how he keeps up with them all." John forced a crooked grin. The other pirates exchanged knowing smirks, and even Whitebeard Edward Newgate let out a booming laugh. When buccaneers gather, the hottest topics are always women, riches, and strength, and today's conversation had delivered in spades. Time flew by in the raucous camaraderie, but pirates live on plunder. Without a score, they'd starve. Locks leaned forward in his lofty captain's chair, silencing the chatter. "Men," he announced, "word has reached me that the annual Heavenly Gold convoy is about to sail. The New World kingdoms will be sending their tribute under heavy guard. There will even be a Navy Lieutenant General providing escort. Our next big haul is that shipment." He swept his gaze over the 8 lieutenants arrayed before him. "This is our chance to strike the skies themselves and seize the heavenly gold." A burst of eager cheers answered him. The sea air crackled with anticipation. They would chart a course, outmaneuver the Navy, and claim their greatest prize yet, gold that fell from heaven. Chapter Anks. A hush fell over the council chamber as Admiral Locke stood at the head of the long obsidian table. Torches flickered in the high arches, casting dancing shadows on the assembled officers. At last, Locke cleared his throat. "The heavenly gold of Kabubing Kingdom will be captured under your command," he announced, pointing to the Golden Lion Shiji and the grizzled veteran known as Whitebeard. "Shiji, Whitebeard, this mission is yours." He swept his arm across the room. "Lingling, you and Charles will seize the heavenly gold of the Skik Kingdom." All eyes turned to Lingling, a lithe swordswoman whose reputation for lightning-quick strikes was well earned, and to Charles, formerly known as Charlotte, whose quiet demeanor belied a fierce determination. Charles stepped forward respectfully and received a sealed dossier. Locke's gaze shifted again. "John Silver Axe and Heighton Muchen, you two will each lead a separate assault force. John, you'll strike at Kabubing. Heighton, you take Sek. Divide and conquer. Leave no noble standing." Murmurs rippled through the officers. One by one, subordinates checked the orders handed to them by the adjutant, their faces illuminated by the parchment's glow. Charles opened his scroll and scanned the details. His target was none other than Vice Admiral Quint Gunther, a towering figure rumored to wield a devil fruit power, transforming him into a mantis-like warrior. The dossier emphasized Gunther's ferocity, animal-type insect fruit, praying mantis form, extremely dangerous. Satisfied, Charles folded the paper and slipped it into his leather satchel. Locke's voice cut through the silence. "Any objections?" he demanded. "None," came a chorus of voices. Locke nodded. "Excellent. Then we move out immediately. Follow your orders to the letter. Victory is non-negotiable." As the officers rose and filed out of the hall, Shiji, the Golden Lion, pulled Whitebeard aside. His tail lashed in irritation. "Damn it! They've given John way the easier job." Whitebeard only chuckled. "Don't worry, Shiji. You'll get your turn to shine." Grumbling under his breath, Shiji strode out into the torchlit corridor, determination blazing in his amber eyes. The campaign for the heavenly gold had begun. Charles watched as the tension rippled across the deck. "Fine," he muttered. "Let the 4 of us go first. Let those underlings taste the danger ahead." Just thinking about Ski set his teeth on edge. Whitebeard lifted a goblet of wine to his lips, then glanced coolly at Shiji without saying a word. Lingling turned to Charles. So what do you think, Charles? Charles rolled his eyes. What do you want, Mom? To say? Do you expect us to defy Captain Locke? If someone's itching for a one-way ticket to an early grave, be my guest. He sighed. You haven't felt this current unless you're deep in the Rock's Pirates' waters. Lingling nodded. All right, get yourselves ready. We sail soon. Whitebeard took another slow sip of wine, then set the cup down and casually hefted his yuncha pistol. Golden Lion exhaled a plume of smoke from his cigar and gave a curt nod. Among the four of them, only two had true flight capability, Golden Lion himself, empowered by the fluttering fruit, and the giant eagle-form Zeus, which Lingling had summoned with her soul fruit. Those two were their only manned air support at the moment. A sleek warship lay moored in the harbor below. Let's move, Golden Lion called, claws flexing in anticipation. Charles, Lingling, Whitebeard, and Shiji dropped smoothly from the cliffside platform, Charles gripping the reins of Zeus, Lingling riding on its broad back, Whitebeard punching the yuncha pistol's handle to activate its thrusters, and Shiji standing firm beside Golden Lion, who beat his luminous wings. In moments, they had descended onto the deck of the waiting vessel. Welcome aboard, Golden Lion rumbled, eyes glowing. Charles took a steadying breath and stepped forward. Whatever lay ahead, they were ready. In the blink of an eye, the little fleet drew near its destination. On a glass-flat sea, 8 vessels sailed in orderly formation, 6 sleek warships escorting 2 slower transport ships. The sun shone high overhead, and all was unnervingly peaceful, until a wild, echoing laugh rolled down from the sky. The sailors froze, heads snapping upward. For a moment, they exchanged bewildered glances. Then Lieutenant General Quint Gunther's face went pale. Beside him, Lieutenant General Marcus Wren stiffened. Pirates! They shouted in unison. Without another word, General Gunther's form shimmered and shifted. In an instant, where once stood a tall, disciplined officer, now crouched a 2-meter-tall praying mantis, its forelegs clicking in anticipation. General Wren drew the long blade from his belt, the steel gleaming in the sunlight. All hands, battle stations, he ordered. Crewmen squinted into the bright sky, unprepared for what came next. One young seaman rubbed his eyes and muttered, "Why does the sun look bigger?" Before anyone could answer, a thunderous voice boomed through the air, unmistakably female, yet charged with power. Prometheus! On cue, a jet of searing flame lanced from above, striking the lead warship's hull. In an instant, black smoke and roaring flames consumed its deck, sending terrified sailors scrambling for cover as the transport fleet rocked with the force of the impact. The pirate assault had begun. Admiral Quint Gunther whirled toward the voice. Well, Navy, hurry up and hand over the heavenly gold for the birthday celebration. High above the deck, flames of red hair billowed around a lone figure standing astride a crackling thundercloud. In one hand he gripped the saber Napoleon. Beneath him roiled the storm-cloud mount, Zeus. I am Charles Lingling, leader of the Rock's Pirates. The saber-wielding naval officer in front of him staggered back, eyes wide. It can't be him. Moments later, a massive golden lion named Shiji materialized beside a sleek pirate vessel tethered to the cloud. On its deck strode 2 more legends, Edward Newgate, Whitebeard himself, and the deadly blood-sword Lord Charles. All 3 were known to be high-ranking officers in the feared Rock's Pirates. Below, every sailor froze. Since Admiral Cyborg Sora's downfall, the Navy had never forgotten the ruthless efficiency of the Rock's Pirates. They're here to seize the heavenly gold. Someone cried. Open fire, Quint Gunther bellowed. Repel the pirates, for justice. Naval lieutenants shouted their assent as the deck crews rushed to the cannon ports. With a thunderous roar, iron shot streaked skyward toward Shiji, Whitebeard, and the Blood-Sword Lord, igniting the first volleys of a battle on the edge of the clouds. Bang, bang, bang! Explosions ripped through the air as cannon shells rained down around them. Edward Whitebeard Newgate narrows his eyes beneath his flowing white beard. He lunges forward, fist cutting through the air, and the oncoming shells detonate harmlessly mid-flight, scattering electric blue shards everywhere. Headquarters, this is Lieutenant General Bill Robb of the Navy. We've made contact with the Rock's Pirates leadership, requesting immediate backup. Drawn by the roar of gunfire, an opposing lieutenant general darts to the communications cabin and grabs the receiver. Headquarters, do you copy? Identify the enemy cadres. A crackling voice responds in the earpiece. Whitebeard Edward Newgate, Golden Lion Shiki, Charles Lingling, and Blood Sword Lord Charles Rockefeller. Damn it, Rob hisses, teeth clenched. Hold your position, the liaison at Navy headquarters replies. I'm relaying your report now. Clutching the phone unit, the colonel races down the corridor toward General Cyborg Sora's office. Bursting inside, he shouts over the drone of the engines. General Sora, have you authorized the support request yet? Chapter 7. Edge of Naval Territory. It'll be faster this way. Besides, we're practically next door to the Navy, Charles said, eyeing the approaching warships through narrowed eyes. A desperate cry for help echoed from across the water, barely registering before Charles sprang into action. With a fluid motion, he drew the long sword sheathed at his waist. The blade caught the late afternoon light as he advanced, every step measured and sure. 4 Navy vessels bore down on them, cannons trained and ready. Charles planted his feet, braced himself for their charge, and then unleashed a single, sweeping slash. His sword bit into the nearest hull with a deafening crack. Wood splintered and twisted beneath the razor edge, sending showers of debris into the air. The other 3 ships staggered, their volleys momentarily halted by the unexpected assault. At Charles's side, Golden Lion Shiji, whose ferocious reputation alone had kept most foes at bay, allowed himself a fierce grin. Seeing Charles strike first was the signal he'd been waiting for. No longer holding back, Shiji let out a thunderous roar that made the deck shudder. His form blurred at the edges as he tapped into his devil fruit power, muscles bulging and hair flaring into a golden mane. Across the splintered planks stood their next opponent, a hulking figure whose very posture marked him as an animal devil fruit user. Claws clicked against the deck in a low, menacing rhythm. But Charles and Shiji stood undeterred. Together, sword and lion's might, they readied themselves for the clash to come, determined to show the Navy that no ship could withstand their combined fury. Chapter 29, Dividing the Spoils, Lion's Roar of the Tides. The words barely left Shiji's lips when his right hand split open into a massive, gleaming claw. With a sweep of his arm, the sea itself obeyed, surging upward into the shape of a gargantuan water lion. It reared back on its haunches, and with a single thunderous chomp, swallowed the enemy warship whole. By the heavens, what sorcery is this? One naval officer shrieked. Reinforcements now, attack! Another barked in panic. Lieutenant General Quint Gunther and his subordinate, Bill Robb, had never felt so helpless. They stared in horror as the 50-meter vessel, creaking, splintering, and screaming, was consumed within the watery maw of Shiji's creation. In less than a heartbeat, nothing remained but swirling foam. Ha! Piece of cake! Shiji crowed, retracting his clawed hand as the water lion dissolved back into the sea. He turned to the 3 officers standing on deck. All were seasoned lieutenant generals, far more capable than that bumbling Carp Sengoku. They nodded in eager agreement. Whitebeard Edward Newgate strode forward, his voice calm but commanding. Load every last chest of gold from those 2 captured ships. We set sail immediately. The Royal Navy will be upon us any moment now. Shiji grinned, sheathing his claw. With a single, fluid motion, he pointed toward the floating hulks. Let's get it done, before they even know what hit them. The crew moved swiftly, hauling treasure aboard under the watchful eyes of their leaders. The spoils of this victory would soon be theirs, and they intended to vanish with every coin. Shiki, the so-called Golden Lion, sat astride his floating flagship, a lit cigar dangling from his lips. With a lazy flick of his wrist, he activated his devil fruit power. Instantly, 2 massive golden treasure ships, each brimming with belly and countless precious goods, rose from the ocean and hovered beside him. The 3 vessels drifted together in the sky like ominous sentinels. Shiki stepped from his own ship onto open air, balancing effortlessly as if he walked on solid ground. In his hand gleamed his famous cherrywood blade, the deathwood cherry, and crimson droplets still clung to its edge. Unlucky, huh? He drawled, voice low and amused. I never expected CP0 agents to be stowed away in there. His crew fell silent at the news. Shiki let out a soft, sinister chuckle, then turned those sharp, golden eyes on his onlookers. So tell me, he purred, don't you all want to know what's hidden inside these ships? Moments ago, Edward Newgate, better known as Whitebeard, had been leisurely sipping wine. Big Mom's daughter Ling Ling and the young Charles, once called Charlotte but very much a boy, had both looked bored. Now, in an instant, all three snapped to attention, eyes locked on Shiki. Whitebeard set down his cup with a hearty chuckle. Ha ha ha! What could be so special that it surprises even you, Shiki? Shiki took a slow drag from his cigar, savoring the moment. Not only are these floating vaults stuffed with belly and treasure, he said, voice thick with promise, they also hold the ocean's greatest secret, devil fruits. A hushed gasp rippled through the gathering. Then, as if carried on a breath of wind, a single, husky voice whispered, "Devil fruits?" All three stared back at Shiki, hearts pounding. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath. "That's right, and there's more than one." Shiki's grin widened. "More than one." Charles, Charlotte Lingling, and Whitebeard Edward Newgate all froze. Devil fruits were notoriously scarce. Charles had spent 5 long years before finally obtaining one of his own. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined discovering 4 of them at once. "What are you talking about, Shiki?" Whitebeard asked, narrowing his eyes at the golden-maned pirate lord. Shiki exhaled a thin plume of smoke and let it drift upward. "Isn't it a waste to just hand them all over to Locke?" A stunned silence fell over the deck. Charlotte Lingling's cake dropped from her hand. Crumbs scattering across the planks. "Well, well, well," she said, stalking toward Shiki. "Are you planning to betray Captain Locke?" Shiki chuckled, a low, rumbling sound like distant thunder. "Betray him? No, no, no. I never swore my loyalty to Locke in the first place. We joined forces because it suited us. Nothing more." He leaned forward, his eyes flicking to Charles. "And you, Newgate? Last I heard, you were searching for your family. Have you had any luck?" Whitebeard Edward Newgate remained impassive, his gaze drifting out to sea as waves sloshed against the hull. No answer came, but the unspoken tension thickened the salty air. Chapter 12. The Giant's Oath. Charles stood on the deck of the Rock's Pirates flagship like a living colossus. At nearly 9 meters tall, the giant's broad shoulders cast a vast shadow over the assembled captains and lieutenants. He'd come here seeking 2 things, asylum from the world's cruelty and a band of brothers he could truly trust. But among the cutthroat warriors who drifted in and out of Rox Diegzebek's fearsome crew, loyalty was a rare commodity. Rumor had it that of the thousands who applied, fewer than 800 ever survived a single order from their merciless captain. Today, 2 of the pirate world's titans stood ready to put Charles to the test. Edward Newgate, better known as Whitebeard, leaned on the haft of his gargantuan Bacento, his lined face shadowed with unease. Beside him, Golden Lion Shiki's metallic claws caught the afternoon sun, his crimson eyes fixed on the giant. "Shiki," rumbled Whitebeard, voice low and gravelly, "you were looking for a recruit worthy of Rox. Is this the one?" Shiki inclined his head. "That he is." He gestured at Charles. "Giant Charles, speak up. Are you the man I've heard about?" From deep in his chest, Charles let out a single resonant grunt. "New." "Child," Shiki continued, stepping forward, "your reasons for joining need no explanation. You seek sanctuary and a crew to call family." Charles remained motionless, his expression unreadable. Whitebeard's gaze hardened, and he let his voice carry across the deck like a clap of doom. "Then decide now. Will you swear yourself to Rox Diegzebek? Will you stand beside him in battle, shoulder to shoulder with every pirate on this ship?" A hush fell. The sails fluttered without wind, and even the sea seemed to hold its breath. But Charles gave no answer. He merely stood there, towering and silent, as the 2 legendary captains watched and waited for his fate to unfold. Shiji threw back his head and laughed. "Ha! It's decided. 4 devil fruits, 1 for each of us." At his command, 4 wooden boxes rose from below and thumped onto the deck. Lids snapped open to reveal their prizes. A dazzling white apple etched with shimmering runes, a deep crimson banana veined with mysterious sigils, a pear-shaped fruit pale as porcelain, marbled with silver, and finally, a blood-red apple streaked with dark, twisting patterns. Shiji folded his arms and nodded at Charles. "You go first, then we'll divide what's left." For a heartbeat there was only silence, until Whitebeard threw his head back and roared, "Goo-ha-ha! I'll take this one!" He snatched up the glowing white apple, its brilliance dancing across his hooked grin. Charles stepped forward. He lifted the silver-marbled pear, turning it over in his hand, but something about its stillness gave him pause. His eyes drifted to the last fruit, the red apple traced with those living, writhing lines. Without another word, he plucked it from its box. "Then I'll take this one," he said. As the red apple settled in his grasp, its pattern seemed to pulse against his palm. He could already feel its power stirring, and knew his choice was the right one. Charles stared at the devil fruits spread out before him, his mind racing. First, those banana-shaped fruits almost always turned out to be zoan types, animal transformations, and with so many creatures to choose from, who knew what form it might grant? And then there was the bright red fruit in his hand. Hitch looked eerily familiar. "I could have sworn I saw this in some anime," he muttered. "Devil fruits that turn up in the original stories aren't exactly weak." "Ha ha ha! This one's mine!" Sheik crowed, snatching up the last empty box on the table. Most of the others barely noticed him, their eyes glued to the fruits they held. None of the three had a devil fruit handbook on hand, so they couldn't be certain what powers they'd won. "Wait," Shiji called, holding up a finger. "Isn't there a devil fruit guidebook on Locke's ship? Why don't we head back and check it out?" The others exchanged glances and nodded. They carefully stowed their fruits and set off for Harkinos aboard their swiftest vessel. In less than 3 days, they returned to Hachinos, an island now unnaturally silent. After asking around, they discovered the reason. John and his men had already rounded up all the local pirates and delivered them over to the 2 allied nations. The docks were empty, and not a soul remained to greet them. Charles frowned, tucking the red fruit safely away. Now that everyone else was gone, they'd have free run of the place. But first, they had a guidebook to consult. Chapter 30, Shipbuilding, Shiji, known far and wide as the Golden Lion, let out a booming laugh. "Ha ha ha! I really envy John and the others. They rake in the treasure of entire nations while we're left scavenging the leftovers, even forced to hand over Deck 7. It's downright insulting." He spat a curse under his breath, then cast a spiteful grin back toward the flagship. From there came Rock's deep, rolling chuckle. "Heh!" Shiji sighed theatrically, trying to smooth his features into a smile. "Come now, Captain. Surely you wouldn't dare reprimand my brave little lion. After all, you know you're my favorite commander." He loaded on the flattery so thickly that even he felt a twinge of disgust. The captain, Locks, offered only a half-smile in response. His gaze was fixed instead on the 2 massive transport ships trailing in their wake. Decades of piracy had honed his instincts. Those gleaming hulls belonged to the world government's gold fleet, laden with the national treasures of half a dozen kingdoms. "Ha ha! Impressive work, gentlemen. Truly worthy captains," Locks declared, his eyes sparkling with ambition. "Let's see what we can build with this haul." When the final tally was in, Locks turned to his 3 comrades with a broad grin. "All right, the entire 3rd deck is yours to use as you see fit." "Ha, thank you, Captain," Locks crowed, throwing a mock bow. Golden Lion Shiji flashed a toothy laugh. "We owe you one, brothers." Then he vanished into the shadows as quietly as he'd appeared. Rocks, meanwhile, gave them all a quick wave, turned on his heel, and slipped out the hatch. Only when the last echo of his steps faded did Charles, formerly Charlotte, but most certainly a young man, exhale in exasperation. "Seriously?" he muttered under his breath. "They're going to split all that sky gold 3 ways? Might as well spit on us." Ski, only just releasing a cloud of cigar smoke, snorted in agreement. Charles ducked below decks to inspect their haul for himself. The hold was stacked high with sky gold ingots, 40 billion in total value, at least by the recent market rates. Their share was 30%, so roughly 12 billion. 4 ways, that boiled down to 3 billion apiece, or, more realistically, after broker fees and bribes, maybe 200 million each. A paltry sum, given the size of their outfits. Shiji's Golden Lion crew alone numbered close to 400 men. 200 million gold coins? Not nearly enough to keep that many soldiers paid and fed. And Charles? He'd need every last bit of funding just to cover the ship's repairs and provisions for the next voyage. He ran a hand through his hair and sighed. "Looks like we'll have to go on another run sooner rather than later." Ski merely crushed out his cigar against the deck. There were more battles and more treasure waiting on the horizon. And if the gold in the holds wasn't enough, Charles was determined to find whatever riches he could, by hook or by crook. Charles climbed back aboard his ship, which had sat in port for nearly 3 months. Every time he'd gone to sea during that time, he'd ended up hopping onto a random vessel or borrowing a ship from one of his fellow captains. It wasn't that Charles didn't want to sail on his own flagship, far from it, but the truth was that his ship wasn't battle-ready. Its defenses were still paper-thin. It felt more like a half-finished prototype than a warship. Originally, he'd planned to launch 3 years from now, but events had pushed him into service ahead of schedule. Fortunately, Hachino's island was teeming with skilled shipwrights. From the start, Charles had hired every craftsman he could find to work on his hull, reinforce the plating, and rig the masts. Now, after 90 days of non-stop labor, the project was nearly complete, and Charles's impatience was mounting. "How much longer until she's seaworthy?" he demanded, striding down the dock toward the old shipwright overseeing the final touches. The man looked up from his chisels and wooden mallet. His hair was white as salt spray, and his face was lined with a lifetime spent at the slipways. Once a pirate himself, he'd served aboard raiding vessels until his last captain was absorbed into a larger fleet. Since then, he'd made a comfortable living on Hachino's, repairing and building ships for anyone with coin to spare. Charles folded his arms. "I need to know if I can take her out by nightfall, or if we'll still be here by sunrise." The old shipwright, known to everyone simply as Grayson, wiped his brow and glanced at the seaworthy beauty stretching down the pier. Its fresh oak planks gleamed, and the new cannons rattled faintly as if eager for action. "Give me 2 more hours," Grayson said, tapping the hull with a practiced ear. "She's sound, just need to drop the lines, haul up the anchor, and we'll have her ready to slice through the waves." A slow grin spread across Charles's face. 2 hours it is," he said, clapping Grayson on the shoulder. "Then we'll finally have a ship fit for a pirate captain." With that, Charles turned to survey his long-awaited flagship, already imagining the thrill of her first voyage. Charles, captain of the 8th Division of the Rock's pirates and undisputed ruler of this island, had put out the word that he needed a ship overhauled. Naturally, everyone with even a scrap of ambition rushed to volunteer. After all, no backing on the island was stronger than that of a senior pirate codger. There was nothing to lose by cozying up to their captain. A short while later, old Jack the shipwright approached with a respectful bow. "Captain Charles, the repair work is nearly finished. If all goes well, she'll be ready to sail in 2 or 3 days." "Excellent," Charles replied, inclining his head. "Let my crew know the moment she's seaworthy." With that, he turned and strode off along the crowded docks. "Now there's a remarkable young leader," old Jack murmured after him. "Captain! Boss!" came calls from every corner as Charles passed. As the senior officer stationed here, he was owed such greetings, and these were the very men who had sailed with him from Kamai Island. They remembered how hard it had been to earn their captain's trust. They wouldn't hesitate to show their respect now. Charles had never been one to mistreat his younger crew members. Over the past 3 months, he'd set sail with them several times, and each time he returned with plunder, he divided it evenly, about 50 Baileys apiece. It wasn't a fortune, but enough to live comfortably on the island for a month. After all, a night in the red light district cost only a few Baileys, and young pirates needed their distractions. On shore, life could grow monotonous. Some of the men threw wild parties to pass the time, others drifted through brothels until dawn. But Charles made every waking hour count. When he wasn't enjoying a rare evening off, he was in the training yard, sharpening his swordsmanship. Watching Tiantian's duel with the Golden Lion and Wang Ji had laid bare shortcomings in his own fighting style, and he was determined to fix them. He'd also strengthened his armament, Haki. Full-body hardening was now second nature, but he still couldn't channel it deeply enough to harm an opponent's interior. Fatigue and frustration often forced him to quit practice early. Bang! A thunderous crack echoed through the clearing as 2 of his crewmates squeezed the trunk of a massive tree and snapped it in half. Charles didn't flinch. A single eyebrow didn't rise. Their display of raw power stirred no pride in him, only a fiercer resolve to surpass them all. Charles slammed his fist into the trunk again, but the tree barely trembled. What he sought wasn't a simple crack. It was an internal collapse, the complete destruction of the tree's core. Yet no matter how he pushed, nothing gave way. All around him, trunks lay splintered, their roots torn from the earth, but each remained stubbornly intact. "Why won't it work?" Charles muttered, staring at the faint ripple of Haki dancing across his knuckles. It was clear he'd never learned the internal destruction technique. He needed help from the samurai siblings, Heitan and Muchan, rumored to have mastered that very style back in Wano country. Without hesitating, he strode toward the 7th Division's quarters. A nervous young pirate guard snapped to attention at the door. "Charles-sama," the guard called, voice quivering. Are Heitan and Muchan here, Captain?" Charles fixed him with a stern look. The guard gulped. "Yes, sir. They've just arrived. This way, please." The guard turned on his heel and led Charles down the corridor. Inside a sparsely furnished room stood 2 tall figures in traditional samurai garb. Their eyes flicked up in unison as Charles entered. He drew a steady breath, ready to learn the technique that would finally let him shatter a tree from the inside out, and perhaps one day shatter far greater obstacles. Charles didn't hesitate. When the guard opened the gate at his request, he slipped inside without a word. From the moment he entered the camp, he could feel it. Dozens of swordsmen's auras pulsed around him, but they were weak, so weak that not one of them reached even a fraction of his power. Charles barely spared them a glance as he strode directly toward Heitan Muchan's pavilion. The swordsmen parted, their eyes widening as he passed. Mutters rippled through the camp. "Who is that newcomer? He moves like a master swordsman. Could this really be the famed Charles?" Charles felt their stares as keenly as they felt his. He walked on, every step confident, every breath measured, ready to face whatever awaited him beside Heitan Muchan. Chapter 31. As soon as Charles set foot inside the Wano camp, a palpable sword intent rippled through the assembled warriors. They fell silent, bowing their heads in deference. These were seasoned samurai, and they recognized a fellow swordsman the moment they laid eyes on him. "Ho ho ho! What brings Captain Charles to our camp?" came a bright, throaty laugh. At that, Heitan Muchan strode forward to meet him. Though he'd heard reports of Charles's exploits, this was their first meeting. Still, he knew well the reputation that preceded the young swordsman, a fearsome skill on par with the Kozuki daimyo himself. "Of course I'm here on your behalf," Charles replied, offering a confident smile. Muchan studied him curiously. In the tales he'd heard, Charles was fierce, almost relentless, but here he stood relaxed, almost playful. And beside him, Muchan still saw a glimmer of her own disguise, a beautiful young woman whose devil fruit power let her mimic any appearance and voice. "Oh?" Muchan tilted her head, stepping closer. "And what exactly do you seek of me, Captain Charles?" Before she could finish, Charles gently but firmly pushed her aside. Heitan Muchan stumbled, but quickly recovered her composure, smoothing the folds of her kimono. "Let's not presume I'm here for a concubine," Charles said coolly, his dark eyes flashing. "My mission is far more pressing." Heitan Muchan's smile wavered as she waited for him to explain. Around them, the camp's samurai stood ready, their blades sheathed but their gazes unblinking. Whatever Charles had come to request, it would require the full might of Wano's finest. And though they respected his prowess, none could predict what challenge lay ahead. Charles clenched his teeth as he glanced at the old woman across from him, picturing her 20 years from now. The image made his stomach churn, but he forced the sensation down and managed a polite smile. Heitan Muchan, however, showed no sign of offense. She sat serenely, legs crossed on the tatami, preparing tea with deliberate calm. "Lady Muchan," Charles began, straightening his back, "you're from Wano country, aren't you?" Heitan Muchan paused mid-tea pour. The faint stream of pale green liquid hovered between pot and cup as she fixed him with a cool, assessing stare. "Captain Charles," she replied, her voice smooth but edged with challenge. "And what makes you think I hail from Wano?" Charles met her gaze without flinching. He recognized the subtle tension in her posture, her attempt to hide her origins. He gave her a small, confident nod. "Your crew includes so many samurai. To the best of my knowledge, only Wano country raises warriors like them." At that, Heitan Muchan set her teacup down with a soft click that rang in the hushed room. She put aside her tea whisk, leaned forward slightly, and regarded him intently. "And just where, Captain," she asked, "did you acquire your knowledge of Wano country?" Charles stood silent as Muchan's brows furrowed. As far as I know, hardly anyone sailing these seas has even heard of Wano country, Haydn said. It's no surprise you'd be ignorant of it. Charles didn't bother to defend himself. After all, Kaido's forces hadn't yet reached these waters, and word of Wano was all but lost here. How I learned of Wano is my concern, Charles replied coolly. I'm not here for idle gossip. I want the domineering art of Wano, Liu Ying. I know you possess its secrets, and I demand you teach me. At that, Haydn's eyes widened. Liu Ying, you speak of it as if it's your birthright, yet why on earth would I hand it over to you? Charles's calm composure cracked. He stepped forward, voice low and hard. I'll give you two choices. You can surrender Liu Ying to me, or you can die. Across the beach, Rox and the others had already left with their spoils. Only Charles and Haydn remained, the tension between them as sharp as a drawn blade. Charles's confidence in killing her swelled to full. He felt certain he could do it. When Haydn Muchen met his cold, unmasked killing intent, her face wee and ashen. She had no chance in a fight against him. If only Kuramaru were here, she thought desperately. Without backup, she couldn't handle Charles alone. Her expression darkened. Aren't you afraid Captain Locke will hold you responsible for murdering me? She asked, each word measured. Charles laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Ha! You really are naive, Haydn Muchen. On the Locke's pirates, loyalty to your crewmates means nothing. You're weak, so you die. Captain Locke will accept it as fate. I am the 7th squad captain now, and I will fill your spot. There's no revenge waiting for you here, only oblivion. He looked down at her with undisguised contempt. Haydn Muchen sagged, the fight leaving her eyes. After a long moment, she drew a shallow breath. If you want Liu Ying's arrogance, she said, her voice trembling, you have to promise me a favor. If you refuse, you'll never get it. With that, she shut her eyes and waited in silence, hoping Charles would agree. Charles's lips curled into a cold sneer as he closed the distance to Haydn Muchen in a single, fluid step. With one hand, he seized her throat, lifting her clear off her feet. You know Liu Ying's domineering technique, he rasped. Hand over the manual now. Haydn Muchen's eyes bulged in panic. Her hands scrabbled at his grip, but he tightened his hold without mercy. Charles didn't speak again. Instead, he reached into her mind, his telepathic talent automatically sifting through layer upon layer of her memories. Muchen thrashed and whimpered, but against Charles's psychic probing, her defenses were useless. Minutes passed like hours. At last, Charles's brow smoothed into a faint, satisfied smile. He withdrew his hand, letting Muchen drop to the floor with a harsh gasp. She clutched her throat, wheezing as her eyes darted up to his. Stop! This is blackmail, she croaked. He dusted imaginary lint from his sleeve. If you think you can threaten me, you've picked the wrong person. I haven't been threatened in my life. He held her gaze coolly. Now, where is the complete domineering technique? Muchen swallowed hard, her defiance drained. It's in my private vault, she admitted, voice trembling. I'll send you the diagrams and instructions. Charles gave a single nod. His expression was unreadable as he straightened, turning away. Inwardly, he couldn't help a wry thought at the absurdity of it all. A boy who could read minds, bullying a cultivator for her secret technique. Pervert or not, Charles had achieved exactly what he'd set out to do. Chapter 7. Charles slammed the tent flap behind him and stalked away without looking back. Don't ever give me that look again, he snarled, voice low and dangerous. It's the same pitying stare you'd give the coward who abandoned his wife and son. Haydn Muchen's face went white with shock and humiliation. She'd thought she could trust him, especially after he'd discovered she'd leaked Liu Ying's secret cultivation method. Now the knowledge that she'd betrayed their closest ally burned in her chest. Humiliated and furious, she vowed silently that Charles would pay for this. Outside the tent, Gong Yifan leaned against the wooden frame, arms folded. He watched Charles step onto the dusty ground, jacket flapping in the breeze. Before either of them could speak, Haydn Muchen came lurching into view, two giggling blondes draped over his shoulders. The women had clearly been drinking. Their perfume mingled with the sharp tang of cheap whiskey on Muchen's breath. Captain Charles, fancy meeting you here, Muchen drawled, flashing a roguish grin at the ladies supporting him. One of them waved sleepily. The other pretended not to notice as she clutched his arm. Charles offered a curt nod. Haiten Muan shrugged off the attention, as though Charles's curt dismissal were no surprise. He'd seen this same aloofness from Charles, even when they faced Captain Locks. "All right, girls," Muan said, patting each of them on the backside with a grin. "You two go on ahead and wait in my room. I've got business to attend to." He winked at Charles, then half-carried, half-dragged the women down the path that led to the officers' quarters. Gong Yifan shook his head, chuckling softly. "You really cut her deep in there, didn't you?" he said, nodding toward the tent. Charles ran a hand through his hair, gaze fixed on the empty flap. "She betrayed us," he said quietly. "Leaked that cultivation technique to Liu Ying's faction. There's no excuse for that." He paused, eyes narrowing. "She'll be back for revenge. I can feel it." Gong Yifan offered a reassuring clap on the shoulder. "Then we'll be ready." As the last echoes of laughter drifted away with Haiten Muan and his entourage, a tense calm settled over the camp. Somewhere inside that tent, Haiten Muchan was already plotting her next move, and Charles knew the real storm was just beginning. "I hate it, my lord." At those words, the two blonde sisters exchanged a nervous glance. Fengquan tapped lightly on Haiten Muan's chest, and Haiten Mumaru, taken aback, released his grip on them. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode toward his sister's chambers. Chapter 32. Charles pushed open the door to his sister's room and froze. Muchan lay sprawled on the floor, her eyes wide with fury as she glared at the doorway. "Sister, what happened? Why are you on the ground?" Charles strode forward, alarm bubbling in his chest. At that moment, their friend Muan burst in behind him. He dropped to one knee beside Muchan, gently tilting her shoulders. She blinked, shaken out of her dizziness. As Muan helped her sit up, his eyes landed on a fresh crimson bruise at the base of her neck. His jaw clenched. "Who did this to you?" Muan's voice was low and fierce. He reached out, worry etched into every line of his face. Charles, too, felt a prickle of suspicion. After all, Charles had been the only one nearby, and everyone knew how impetuous he could be. Muchan yanked her head away, pinching Muan's ear so hard he hissed in pain. "Let go. I'm fine. I just got back from Huaji." She rubbed her sore spot and glared at them both. Muan's anger only flared brighter at the mention of Huaji. "Do you have any idea what Charles was doing out there?" he demanded, eyes shifting accusingly toward his friend. Charles opened his mouth to defend himself, but for once he found himself at a loss for words. The two of them bore down on him with those accusing stares, and he realized this was going to take more than a simple explanation to set things right. "He found out we're from Wano and threatened me, demanding Liu Ying's domineering cultivation method, and swore he'd kill your sister if I didn't hand it over." Haiten Muchan's grip tightened as he yanked Haiten Muan by the ear. "He dared threaten my sister? I'll tear him apart myself." Muan whirled to face Charles, his cheeks flushed with fury. "Hold on, do you really think you can take him on?" Muchan's hand dug deeper into his brother's ear. "I can," Muan stammered, though his confidence trembled. Muchan smirked, a cold glint in his eye. "You sure about that? You ready to die already?" Straightening his shoulders, Muan's voice rang with conviction. "Even if I can't beat him, he won't lay a finger on me." His calm certainty came from the superhuman barrier fruit he'd eaten. Its impenetrable shield made him all but invulnerable, precisely why he and his siblings had risen to become trusted officers of the Rock's pirates. Haiten Muchan shook his head. "Forget it. We'll avenge this humiliation sooner or later. Anyway, he didn't steal Liu Ying's armament Haki from me." At Haiten Muchan's words, Haiten Muan let out a relieved sigh. Don't let his bold, fearless facade fool you. It was all for show. The mere thought of Charles' blade slashes still sent chills down his spine. Facing him in actual combat? Unthinkable. Meanwhile, after securing Liu Ying's armament Haki technique, Xiaoluo returned to his private training grounds. There, he replayed every fragment of Haiten Muchan's memory recording to study the new method. To his surprise, this version of armament Haki didn't harden like steel on its own. Instead, it flowed like a liquid, conforming to the user's needs. It could still coat the body and weapons, enhancing defense and cutting power, but it retained a fluid flexibility he'd never seen before. Most crucially, this liquid Haki manifested as a tangible force capable of striking even nature-type devil fruit users. Those who normally turned into elements like fire, ice, or lightning, and were all but untouchable. Without armament Haki, no one could hope to land a blow on them. Now that he understood how Liu Ying's method worked, Xia Luo knew exactly what to practice next, and how to finally level the playing field against the world's most dangerous powers. Charles punched through another wooden plank, the fragments of gravel and splinters crunching beneath his feet. Ever since Xia Luo had mastered the armed color domineering technique, she'd laid out a rigorous training regimen, and he'd stuck to it religiously. "Start flowing with your strikes," Xia Luo's voice rang out from her porch. Charles adjusted his stance and unleashed a flurry of blows, each one cleaner and more precise than the last. Suddenly, a panicked shout cut through the air. "Boss! Boss!" Charles froze mid-punch, surveying the scattered debris. His crew came barreling toward him, faces pale. "What's the matter? It sounds urgent." One of the men gulped air before blurting, "We've run out of supplies, and there's no money left in the coffers." Charles frowned, brushing splinters from his knuckles. They'd been drilling every day, refusing to pillage coastal villages or beg for provisions. Yet somehow, their funds had evaporated. If they wanted coin, there was only one solution that worked fast: seafaring profit, by any means necessary. "All right," Charles said, his tone decisive. "Prepare the boat. We set sail at first light. I'll go speak with Rocks." He shrugged into his jacket and strode toward the heart of the island, where a sleek new vessel bobbed in the harbor. Charles paused at the gangway, admiring her lines. 120 meters long, 20 meters wide, built for speed and cargo, she gleamed in the morning sun, a promise of opportunity. With a final nod to his crew, Charles climbed aboard. Tomorrow, they'd hunt for gold on the open sea. And this time, failure was not an option. The great wooden ship rode the waves like a living beast, its 3 towering masts creaking in the wind. Though no ironclad, this vessel, named the Sea Lion, could carry over 800 souls. 70 sailors and what might be called sailor fighters lived below decks, each one trained by Charles himself to haul ropes and furl sails as deftly as they wielded sword or pistol. Charles stepped into the main hall, and the rich scents of salt, spilled wine, roasted meat, and frying fish washed over him. Long oak tables ran the length of the cabin, where crewmen laughed, drank, and told tall tales. "Well, well, if it isn't our boy Charles," came a familiar voice. Charles didn't need to turn to know who spoke. First Mate John swaggered forward, ale in hand and a roguish grin on his face. "John," Charles said evenly, "if you ever get tired of that head of yours, I'd be happy to supply you with a new one, no extra charge." A roar of laughter erupted. Beside John, Golden Lion Shiji, so nicknamed for his fiery mane, slapped the table until tankards danced. Whitebeard let out a deep, rumbling chuckle that rattled the benches. "Har! That's the spirit, Charles!" Shiji whooped. "Har, har, har!" Whitebeard bellowed. John's grin turned a fraction too wide as he shot Shiji a sharp look, but Charles merely inclined his head, amused. They'd sailed together for half a year now. Nothing short of a broadside would upset this ragtag family. Suddenly, Shiji rapped the table with his fist, silencing the nearest men. Beneath the boisterous laughter, tension flickered among the junior officers below decks. An undercurrent Charles recognized well, but he didn't bother to look. Let them bicker. His mind was already on the chart laid out in his cabin, and the fortune waiting for them beyond the next horizon. Charles leaned against a sturdy pillar and surveyed the room, his expression unreadable. The sea lion creaked and settled beneath him, as if urging him onward. He took a slow breath of salty air and gripped the hilt at his side. Adventure, he reminded himself, had always been Jover the next wave. Charles stepped into the grand throne room and froze. From his seat atop the dais, Locke glanced down at him, a wry smile playing on his lips. "Charles, what are you doing here?" Locke asked, his tone amused. At once, the raucous chatter of the pirate captains and officers died away. All eyes turned to Charles, an unexpected sight among them. Charles shrugged casually. "My crew's flat broke. We need a new score. Time to take to the seas and raid again." A roar of laughter rippled through the hall. Locke leaned forward, drumming his fingers on the gilded armrest. "Of course. What are pirates for, if not for plunder? I have just the target for you." With a flourish, he tossed a rolled parchment across the floor. "It uncook. URL to reveal a detailed map, with one realm circled in bold crimson ink. The Kingdom of Karante. Locke declared. "You will sail in, seize their treasure, and bring me the king's head. In return, you may keep 30% of whatever you claim." Charles caught the map, studied it briefly, then gave a crisp nod. "Understood." Without another word, he turned and strode from the chamber, his boots echoing on the marble floor. As his silhouette vanished through the great doors, Locke leaned back in his throne and rested his chin on his knuckles, watching the empty corridor. "An odd one," he murmured to himself. "He cares nothing for drink or gold, only for power." A slow smile spread across Locke's face. "Let him grow stronger. I'd rather have a genius like that under my command than at someone else's. This is exactly what I've been looking for. After all, if you want to accomplish great things, you'll need a few capable men by your side." Chapter 33, The Kingdom of Courant. "Captain!" Charles strode onto the bustling dock, his long sword clinking against his hip. A junior crewman, clutching a rolled chart, dropped to one knee before him. "The men are ready," the youth reported breathlessly. Charles nodded once, then pressed the parchment into the young sailor's hands. "We sail for this point," he said, pointing to a marked spot. "Loot everything of value." "Aye, sir." The crewmen snapped to attention, tucking the chart beneath his arm. He glanced back at the assembled pirates. "All hands, weigh anchor and set course for the Kingdom of Courant." From the prow of his flagship, a sleek 100-meter gunship emblazoned with the black and gold banner of the Rocks Pirates, 8th Division, Charles watched the port recede into the morning haze. Along the waterfront, rival pirate crews paused to stare. "Is the 8th Division really heading out to pillage?" murmured a burly buccaneer, nudging his companion. "By the look of that ship, they mean business." His mate shrugged. "Pirates don't sail these waters for sightseeing. Somebody's about to regret crossing their path." Unbeknownst to them, a covert agent, disguised in tattered pirate garb, slipped into the shadows behind a stack of crates. He pressed a hidden transmitter to his lips. "Naval Command, this is Agent Blue. The captain of the 8th Division of the Rocks Pirates is setting sail. They're bound for plunder. Over." "Command copies," crackled the distant reply. "All units, prepare to intercept. Over and out." The agent snapped off his earpiece and dashed down the quay toward the naval headquarters. His dark cloak whipped behind him as he called out, "General, urgent report from the docks." Within moments, he burst into General Cyborg's office, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Sir," he panted, "the Rocks Pirates are underway. They've charted a course straight for Courant. Orders?" General Cyborg rose from his command table, eyes hard as steel. "Sound the alarm," he ordered. "Assemble the fleet. Nobody gets to Courant before we do." Admiral Kong barely had time to finish his morning coffee when the Herald's emergency bulletin cut through the calm. "The Rocks Pirates are on the move again." Lieutenant Cyborg Sora straightened in his seat. "Sir, it's Captain Charles Rockefeller leading this raid. Intelligence is still sketchy, but it appears to be a large-scale sea robbery." Kong slammed his fist on the polished mahogany desk. The impact made the small communication bug bounce in his hand. "Damn them! The Rocks Pirates again!" He waved an aide forward, ready to broadcast a pursuit order. But then he hesitated. The New World branch was critically understaffed. Every seasoned commander had been dispatched overseas to maintain order, leaving headquarters with only junior officers and support staff. With a heavy sigh, Kong set the bug down. The red status light blinked mockingly. "What good is an alarm if we have no one to respond? Why are all our best fighters abandoning the Navy for piracy?" He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, frustration etched into every line of his face. Sora exchanged a worried glance with the aide. The sprawling maps on the war table showed countless trade routes. Any one of them could be Charles Rockefeller's next target. Outside the observation window, gray waves rolled toward the horizon, carrying the ominous promise of another pirate raid. Admiral Kong took a deep breath. "Prepare what ships we have. Even if they're outnumbered, they must intercept Captain Rockefeller before he strikes again." He forced himself to meet Sora's eyes. "No matter the odds, we cannot let him slip through our fingers." Charles glanced up at the rolling sea and replayed the plan in his mind. "We need the 5 Elder Stars on our side if we're ever going to convince the world government to beef up the Navy. But whoever heard of a speedy approval from that lot? Lobbying them takes months, if not years." Before he could dwell on that headache, a young deckhand crept up behind him, eyes wide with excitement. "Captain, we're almost in position." Charles straightened, his gaze locking onto a faint speck on the horizon. It was growing rapidly in the dawning light, its shape sharpening against the gray sky. He lifted a hand and called out calmly, "All right, prepare to fire." His voice carried across the deck. 40 cannons, each loaded by jittery gunners, answered his command. Charles knew full well that these guns were little more than show against true naval power. Against hardened privateers or a real warship, they were toys compared to what his sword could do up close. Yet today, this was all they had. Back on shore, the port's lookouts spotted the approaching vessel and panicked. "Sir, there's a ship heading straight for us. And look at those sails, black as midnight." A murmur of dread spread through the dock workers. "Pirates!" someone screamed, and chaos erupted. Suddenly, the pirate ship boomed to life. A volley of cannon fire thundered over the water, slamming into the wooden wharves and sending up plumes of splintered timber and seawater. On Charles's deck, the first impact rocked the hull, sounding like the crack of a giant's whip. But Charles merely tightened his grip on the railing, eyes fixed on the enemy's outline. "Return fire," he ordered, voice steady. "Aim for their hull. Don't let them board us." As his crew scrambled to their stations, Charles allowed himself one grim smile. The hunt for the 5 Elder Stars could wait. Today, survival came first. Charles stood at the bow as the great cannon thundered, its iron shot hurtling the 100 meters to the quay. The blast struck with earth-shaking force, and 4 unfortunate townsfolk collapsed in an instant. "Pirates! Help us!" someone screamed, panic rippling through the crowd. "Where are they? Where are they coming from?" Just then, 1,000 city soldiers spilled through the main gate, led by a broad-shouldered general with a bristling mustache. His heavy boots pounded the cobblestones as he strode forward, eyes fixed on Charles's ship. Charles allowed himself a faint smile. He could feel the general's strength even at this distance. "Interesting," he murmured. "There really is a formidable warrior here." The mustached commander halted his troops and studied the black flag snapping in the harbor breeze. Recognition and dread flashed across his face. "I knew it," he whispered hoarsely, voice tinged with despair. This will spell disaster for the kingdom." On deck, Charles gave the order. The anchor clanged, the gangplank rattled into place, and the pirate vessel ground slowly alongside the quay. All eyes turned to the young captain, who stepped forward, barely more than a boy, yet brimming with cold resolve. The general's face went ashen, his trembling lips parted. "Blood, blood," he gasped, the single word a chilling prophecy of what was to come. Chapter 7. The Siege of Silverport. A single war horn split the morning air. "Bloodsword Master Charles!" From their ranks of 1,000 Imperial Guards, seasoned soldiers shook their heads in disbelief. Many had seen the wanted posters proclaiming the reward. 800 million silver, all for Charles Rockefeller, the Bloodsword Lord. Even the regiment's commander, sword trembling in hand, felt a chill race down his spine. Behind Charles, his pirate crew burst into action the moment the ship nudged the harbor wall. Their boots clanged on the iron gangplank as they poured onto the quay, eyes alight at the sight of Silverport's bustling docks and the gleaming palace crowning the hill beyond. Charles disembarked last, his hand resting on the hilt of his greatsword. He paused on the wooden planks of the wharf, taking in the colorful sails, stacked cargo crates, and the distant roar of a waking city. "What a thriving island," he murmured, the bustle stirring memories of his own home, Kamei Island. Then he turned his gaze to the disciplined ranks before him, over 1,000 armed soldiers, their spears and muskets leveled in unison. Charles squared his shoulders and spoke, in a calm, even tone. "Lay down your weapons and spare your lives." His voice was quiet but carried across the stone quay. In an instant, nearly 100 pirate voices rose in chorus behind him. "Lay down your weapons and spare your lives." Sparks flew as bayonets kissed sword blades. The Imperial Guards braced for confrontation, but Charles simply smiled, confident that soon enough, Silverport would fall into his hands. The dust of the battlefield swirled in the late afternoon sun, but the 1,000-strong Imperial army stood frozen, gazes fixed on the mere 100 pirates arrayed against them. At their helm, a burly, bearded general scanned his troops. Their faces were ashen, hope it seemed, had already slipped from their hearts. The general's jaw tightened. He forced himself forward, voice like thunder. "Pirate Hugh!" Before he could finish, a brilliant white flash erupted at the front of the pirate line. It cleaved through the air so swiftly that the general barely had time to register it. A brutal pain exploded in his chest. He staggered once, then folded in half, collapsing in a crimson heap. "General!" His soldiers screamed in unison, rushing to their commander's side. Their eyes flicked wildly from the fallen leader to the lone boy who had struck the blow. Charles emerged from the haze of dust, sword slipping effortlessly back into its polished scabbard. At that single movement, a metallic chorus rang out. Weapons clattered to the ground. Shield straps buckled. Helmets hit earth. One by one, the Imperial soldiers relinquished their arms and fell back, forming a corridor through which Charles stood unchallenged. They could not dare oppose him. Hadn't they just watched this boy slice their general in two? In that moment, fear curdled into fervor. Voices rose in a tremulous chant. "Long live the Rocks Pirates! Long live the Rocks Pirates!" Charles let the shouts wash over him, his expression cool, almost amused. He tilted his head and surveyed the surrendered ranks with an air of contempt. The battle was over. The victory belonged to him. All the noise came from the impeccably uniformed officers clustered nearby, their voices the loudest of all. Charles sneered at their pomp and swagger, then turned and led the pirates under his command toward the city gate. Chapter 34, The Fall of the Gorant Kingdom. It's over. The city guard has surrendered. General Solo fell in battle, and the Gorant Kingdom is doomed. Charles strode into the city at the head of nearly 100 pirates. What had once been a quiet provincial town now dissolved into chaos. Panicked citizens flooded the streets, and opportunistic thug gangs took advantage of the confusion. In darkened alleys, they robbed, killed, and even assaulted innocent bystanders. As the screams and shouts multiplied, Charles's gaze hardened. He drew his sword in one swift motion, cutting down a would-be rapist before he could flee. At the sight of their leader's ruthless blade, even his own men froze in shock, their greed and predatory impulses extinguished in an instant. Behind an officer's careful guidance, Charles pressed on toward the palace gates. The worn stone walls of the fortress loomed ahead, but as the pirate company approached, a cannonball thundered out from the ramparts. Charles didn't hesitate. He raised his sword, deflecting the shot harmlessly skyward. No sooner had the first echo died than a second cannonball slammed into the palace wall, splintering masonry and sending debris showering onto the plaza. "Seize them!" Charles commanded, his voice cool and measured. At once, the pirates surrounding him sprang to life, eager eyes gleaming with anticipation. They surged forward en masse, weapons raised, ready to breach the palace and, in Charles's words, take what remains of this kingdom. In that moment, it was clear. Gorant's destiny had been sealed. Under the black flag of piracy, Charles and his brethren began the final assault that would bring the once proud kingdom crashing down. "Come with me." At Charles's signal, the dozen pirates at his side hoisted their swords and poured through the palace gates. He'd long since traded his old life for this one, becoming a pirate among pirates, and there was no turning back now. Nearly 100 cut a swath through the antechamber, but Charles remained perfectly still for a moment, surveying the scene. He turned to the palace guard captain, who stood shaking at his elbow. "Lead me to your king," Charles said, his voice calm, eyes cold. "Yes, of course!" the captain stammered and hurried away, Charles and his crew close on his heels. Along the corridor, faint sobs and forced laughter echoed from open chambers, but Charles ignored them. He simply let the trembling captain guide him straight to the throne room. Inside, a disheveled middle-aged man stood alone before the empty dais, hair in wild tangles, robes in ruins. He bellowed at the intruders. "You, rebels, thieves, you've betrayed your king." Charles recognized him at once, the very monarch who had dared reject Locke's demands and humiliate him over the royal messenger. That bold insolence had cost this king his throne and earned Charles's begrudging respect. Charles stepped forward across the marble floor. He lifted his chin and spoke, voice low and unwavering. "Your Majesty is deposed. Here, and everywhere, you answer to the black tide now." With that, the pirates behind Charles raised their weapons in salute. The throne room fell silent at the promise of a new reign. Chapter 8. The King's Last Demand. "You will die," King Aurelius roared, eyes flashing with rage. He hefted his greatsword and swung at Charles's throat with all his remaining strength. But Charles was ready. The blade bit only air as he sidestepped, and the sword clattered uselessly against the marble floor. With that, the king's knees buckled. He dropped to his hands and knees, silent at last. Charles leaned against a broken column, watching the fallen monarch with cool detachment. Lord Locke had been explicit. He wanted the king's head as proof of victory. No mercy, no debate. "Commander Reinhardt," Charles called to the officer in charge of the royal guard. The man's uniform was flecked with ash and blood, his eyes wide with fear. "Sever his head and bring it to me." Reinhardt swallowed hard, glancing at the scatter-raised soldiers who were already looting the palace's treasures. "My liege?" "Do it now," Charles said quietly, but without room for refusal. With shaking hands, Reinhardt knelt beside the king's fallen body. He retrieved the greatsword from the king's lifeless grip, then closed one eye and swung. There was a single, clean slice. The king's head rolled onto the cold stone, leaving his body there in mute disgrace. A thin mist of blood pooled around his shoulders. Charles felt a flicker of nausea. Beheading was brutally efficient, entirely uncivilized, yet necessary. "Pick it up," he ordered, nodding toward the severed head, "and follow me." Silently, Reinhardt did as he was told, cradling the head against his chest. Charles turned on his heel and walked out of the throne room. In the courtyard, chaos reigned. Soldiers and mercenaries clashed over gold-encrusted chalices. Tattered banners fluttered above smoldering pavilions. Smoke curled into the night sky, and the shouts of looters rang hollow in the wake of triumph. Charles paused, pressing his fingers to his temple. A headache throbbed behind his eyes. War was never clean, and tonight was no exception. It was Charles's first time leading a strike that toppled a kingdom single-handedly, and he still felt oddly unsettled. He waved two pirates over. "Take the king's head," he ordered. "Stow it safely and bring it with you when you leave." The nearest pirate bowed sharply, eyes widening as he recognized Charles. He snatched the severed head from the soldier's hands and hustled away. Once they were gone, Charles turned to the rest of his crew. Thankfully, the palace was compact enough that rounding them up wasn't a struggle. Over an hour later, sacks of gold coins and gemstones lay emptied on the marble floor, and barrels of Baikal whiskey had been rolled away. Charles frowned. This haul still didn't feel like enough. That's when he spotted the lone military officer in his resplendent dress uniform, lingering near the shattered throne. Charles's gaze sharpened. "Do you know where the nobles are gathering?" he demanded. The officer, still white-knuckled from decapitating his own king, blinked in shock. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a strangled curse, "You fiend!" he swept up the royal sword and swung at Charles. A lazy smile curved Charles's lips. He reached out one hand, pinched the blade's tip between his fingers, and let a faint, ominous glow swirl up his arm. Charles laughed, a low, victorious sound. He shook his head, and the officer's sword snapped in his grip. In one swift motion, Charles gripped the man by the throat and dragged him upright. In an instant, he learned the whereabouts of the fleeing nobles, and discovered why the officer had resisted so fiercely. The man was a noble himself. "All right, men," Charles barked, his eyes gleaming. "After them, let's round up every last one." "Aye, long live the boss," the pirates roared, brandishing cutlasses and pistols. Charles allowed himself a small, wry smile as he led the charge out of the palace gates. All through the night, they swept through the noble quarter, house by house, vault by vault, driving their prey before them. At dawn, they returned to the ship, laden with more treasure than any of them had ever seen. Heaped on the deck lay chests overflowing with gold and gems. Charles whistled in disbelief. "Ha! That earl's fortune alone dwarfs the king's treasury." Earlier, in the royal vault, they'd claimed some 50 million Bailey in coin. But here, in the gilded mansions of the nobles, they'd uncovered well over 1 billion Bailey more. Charles had thought the haul from the fortress was impressive, but this was unimaginable wealth. His heart raced with greed as he surveyed the glittering piles. Without hesitation, the pirates prepared to strike again, house after opulent house, until not a single noble remained unrobbed. Charles stood on the deck, staring at the mountains of glittering loot piled before him. Just one night of raiding had yielded 50 billion Bailey coins, if any were needed, that murder and arson were the quickest routes to riches. "Boss, we've hauled it all up," one of the pirates called out, his voice brimming with excitement. Charles tightened his grip on the railing as his crew crowded around the treasure. "Remember our deal," he said evenly. "Half of this haul goes to Lord Locke, the rest is ours." A collective groan swept through the men, but Charles paid them no mind. Half of 50 billion still left them with 25 billion Bailey coins, more than enough to keep any pirate happy. Yet he raised a hand to silence their complaints. "Each of you takes 500 million, he announced. "No one gets more. Anyone who tries will answer to me personally." Greed flickered in several eyes, but under Charles's cool stare, the pirates fell silent. He had earned their respect by treating them better than any captain they'd ever known, unlike the tyrant John, who had hoarded his men's shares until they revolted, only to watch his empire collapse and his crew starve. Charles wasn't about to make the same mistakes. He let the men file forward in turn to claim their coins, then counted out his own share at the end. 20 billion Bailey coins remained in his chest, enough to see him through a year of easy living with no urgent debts or unexpected crises to worry about. As the last pirate stumbled off the deck, pockets bulging with gold, Charles allowed himself a small smile. He might be young, but he'd never forget the lesson John had taught. Wealth was only as good as the loyalty it bought. And with that in mind, Charles felt richer than any pirate alive. "Long live the boss," the crew roared in unison. 500 million credits might not seem like much to some, but in their hands it was more than enough. They cheered as they counted out the bills, already planning their night in the red light district. That windfall would last them through many wild parties. "Set course for Hachino's Island," Charles called out from the quarterdeck. "Aye, Captain," the helmsman answered, and the ship turned slowly away from the shoreline. Behind them, the coast was a ruin. Smoke still curled skyward over the smoldering remains of Carante. The once proud kingdom lay in ashes as Charles's vessel slipped into open water, bound for new horizons. Chapter 35. Return to Hachino's. Charles stepped onto the docks of Hachino's, the severed head of King Glenty secured in a satchel at his side. He still didn't know the king's name until the moment he cut it down, but the job was done. He strode into the grand hall where Pirate Lord Lox held court and presented his grisly prize. Lox took the satchel without moving his eyes from the table. With a flick of his wrist, he dumped the head onto the floor and shrugged as though discarding refuse. "Ha!" he roared with laughter. "Well done, Charles. Tell me, what reward do you seek?" Charles hesitated only an instant. Memories of Glenty's final gasp and the weight of his own ambition sharpened his resolve. "I want everything you have on domination techniques and swordsmanship cultivation," he said. For a heartbeat, Lox stared at him. Then a broad grin split the pirate lord's scarred face. "Perfect choice," he exclaimed. "You'll have it. Return to your ship and wait for my men to deliver it." Charles bowed deeply and left the hall. He believed Lox's promise completely. Back aboard his own vessel, Charles made his way to the private cabin. He sank onto the worn leather sofa, stretched out, and stared up at the low ceiling. Overhead, a sturdy pull ring held the pouch containing his devil fruit, his most precious secret. As he lay there, the soft creak of the ship rocking on the waves, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Power was within his grasp at last. Chapter Text: The Devil Fruits and the Blood Sword Master. At that moment, only 2 devil fruits remained unclaimed. One was the frost fruit, already notorious for its bone-chilling power, and the other was the bomb fruit, recently spotlighted in the Grand Line. Rumor held that this second fruit belonged to the so-called Booger Man, and to Charles's surprise, the rumors were true. The bomb fruit had indeed fallen into that odd fellow's hands. Late that evening, Charles leafed through his battered devil fruit compendium until he came across the bomb entry. Drawing on memories from his previous life, he knew all too well how devastatingly explosive, even far from mastered, this fruit could be. Still, he shook his head. The sea, and worse yet, sea prism stone would rob any devil fruit user of their power in an instant. Charles refused to saddle himself with such a glaring weakness. Better, he decided, to leave the bomb fruit for someone hungrier for raw power. or simply lock it away as a trophy. Time slid by. Whispers reached every port that the Karante Kingdom had been utterly annihilated by a pirate known only as the Blood Sword Master. Crimson-inked wanted posters soon plastered every wharf, a 1 billion berry bounty on Charles's head. As captain of the 8th Division of the Rock's pirates, Charles had spearheaded audacious raids on marine armadas, amassed untold riches, and razed kingdom after kingdom with ruthless efficiency. His name alone sent tremors through the New World. Now, in the dim glow of his cabin lantern, Charles traced the edges of that new wanted poster tacked above his bunk. It had been a year since he vowed never to consume another devil fruit, and instead forge his legend with nothing but steel and unrelenting bloodshed. Nearly every month Charles sailed under Captain Locke's banner, carving bloody swathes through the oceans. With each successful raid, the fearsome reputation of the Rock's pirates swelled, and yet Charles found himself unsettled by the true might of their fleet. Over the past year, he had borne witness to countless skirmishes, watched comrades fight side by side, and observed the rise of several codders whose deeds spread like wildfire among the crew. As Charles studied the power structure aboard ship, he realized that, apart from the core leadership, 2 rival factions dominated the Rock's pirates. The first was Shiki, the Golden Lion's 2nd Division. After 12 months of relentless recruitment and conquests, Shiki's forces numbered nearly 2,000 hardened fighters. Wielding the terrifying strength granted by his Golden Lion fruit, Shiki now prowled the New World on a scale few rival captains could match. Even the Navy dared not challenge him directly. Its admirals could only glare up at his flag, knowing that, short of a direct order from someone like Admiral Locke himself, they dared not interfere. Opposing Shiki's juggernaut was the allied fleet of John Silveraxe and Wang Ji. Under John's shrewd command, and bolstered by Wang Ji's own formidable reputation, this coalition stood as the only real counterweight to the Golden Lion's march. Wherever Shiki's banner cast its shadow, John and Wang Ji marshaled their ships, ready to contest every inch of ocean. Caught between these titans, Charles understood that the balance of power within the Rock's pirates hinged on their rivalry. And in the months to come, as Locke's grand designs unfolded, the struggle between Shiki's 2nd Division and the Silveraxe Wang Ji fleet would determine not only the fate of the Rock's pirates, but the very shape of the New World itself. Charles felt completely outmatched by Golden Lion Shiki. His own fleet couldn't match Shiki's mobility. All he could do was scrounge whatever scraps Shiki left behind. Yet, even after picking up those leftovers, Charles still commanded nearly 1,000 pirates. He couldn't shake the suspicion that the legendary Rock's pirates had a hand in it. Otherwise, how could John possibly bankroll such a large force? The other pirate captains paid little mind to the simmering feud between these two camps. Edward Whitebeard Newgate drank his fill every day and answered to no one but his first mate, Locke, though even Locke trembled in his presence. And then there was Big Mom. Charlotte Linlin, perpetually pregnant, constantly giving birth to a new brood, each more enormous than the last. That alone was surprising, but what shocked Charles most was her latest declaration. She intended to have a child by him. Charles's temper flared. "Who do you think I am?" he snapped. "Just because I'm, well, you know, doesn't mean I'll sleep with anyone on a whim." He stared her down and refused outright. Linlin's eyes narrowed at the insult. Pride wounded, she let out a roar of rage, and in an instant, the two of them were at each other's throats, sparks flying as their clash ignited. Chapter 3. At this point, Charlotte Linlin hadn't yet reached the fearsome heights she would in later years. Her devil fruit power and mastery of Haki were far from legendary. Only her raw physical strength was truly intimidating. Even so, she proved a formidable opponent, and Charles felt every ounce of her power when they finally met in combat. Their duel raged for 2 days and 2 nights. Sword blades clashed, bursts of Haki rippled through the air, and shockwaves smashed against the rocky shores. They fought so fiercely, they nearly shattered the island beneath their feet. Yes, this was Beehive Island. After Captain Locke assembled his fleet of pirates, he rechristened Hachino's Island as Beehive Island, a name that would later become infamous as Blackbeard's stronghold. It was here that Charles first realized the length and breadth of Linlin's future reputation. At last, the battle reached its climax, when Linlin unleashed her conqueror's Haki in a single, overwhelming explosion of force. Caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of her aura, Charles staggered back. He knew in that moment that, had the fight continued, defeat would be inevitable. That realization weighed heavily on him. The calendar read 1481 in the Great Age of Piracy, and the legendary Rocks pirates were destined to fall in less than 3 years. If Charles hoped to survive, and perhaps even make a mark on the world, he had to grow stronger and fast. From that day forward, Charles took to the sea with renewed determination. He captained his own pirate ship, drilling his younger crewmates in swordplay and navigation. Day after day, they cut their wake through the waves, chasing strength, reputation, and the promise of adventure across the open ocean. Charles had learned lie on that life at sea left no room for complacency. One moment you're battling pirates, the next you're up against the Navy. He'd sparred with more than his share of notorious sea rovers, none rivaling the legendary Roger pirates, whose fame eclipsed every other crew. Lucky as he was, Charles had never tangled with anyone beyond his skill, until now. Barely half a month into this voyage, word reached him of a Navy prodigy carving his own name into legend, Black Arm Zephyr. No sooner had Charles's ship cleared the harbor than Zephyr's flagship bore down on him. At first sight, the officer's scarlet-tinged arm gleamed with an almost supernatural force. Zephyr squared his shoulders, shouted about justice and order, then lunged at Charles like a feral beast unleashed. Their first clash was brief but brutal. Charles blocked blow after blow, only to stagger back as if struck by a gale. Shocked, he realized this wasn't ordinary strength. Zephyr's armament Haki was off the charts. Every encounter left Charles more bruised than the last. In the space of days, he fought Zephyr 3 times, each duel ending the same way. With Charles on the defensive, desperate to parry a barrage he could neither predict nor withstand. Late one evening, as the moonlight danced on splintered deck planks, Charles stared at his knuckles, blackened and aching. How had Zephyr grown so impossibly powerful since they'd last met in their academy days? Back then, the officer had been cocky but hardly invincible. Now Zephyr was the Navy's hammer, crushing any who dared defy the world government. Charles drew a slow breath. He knew he couldn't hope to match that raw, honed intensity head-on, yet surrender wasn't in his nature. If he couldn't overpower Zephyr, he'd outthink him. And as dawn broke over the restless sea, Charles resolved to learn everything he could about armament Haki, and to find a way to bend its power to his own will. The chase was far from over. It was only just beginning. A dark, domineering aura surged around Zephyr's arm, channeling so much power into his wrist that he stopped the blade in mid-slash with raw force alone. Even News King Morgans managed to capture the moment on camera, instantly cementing Zephyr's reputation and earning him the title Black-Armed Zephyr. Chapter 36, Combat. Charles had never guessed that the nickname Black-Armed Zephyr actually stemmed from his own name. The Navy seized on the coincidence and blew it up across the seas. After more than a year of being stymied by the Rocks pirates in the New World, they finally claimed a rare victory. Their spokesman proclaimed, Vice Admiral Zephyr, now dubbed the Black Wrist, is in hot pursuit of Charles, captain of the 8th Division of the Rocks, and legendary swordsman of blood. When Charles first saw the sensational headlines, fury boiled up inside him. Every officer in the Locks fleet was whispering and snickering, and a few bold youngsters even laughed outright. But those derisive chuckles were cut brutally short. In a heartbeat, Charles summoned his sword energy and sent the mockers crashing to the deck. Tales of his ruthless counterstrike spread immediately, redeclaring him the blood sword hero, albeit with a darker, more notorious edge this time. Just as Admiral Zephyr, Fleet Admiral Sengoku, and Vice Admiral Karp were narrowing in on his location, the Navy Command issued a recall. The 3 titans of the fleet, Zephyr's relentless pursuit, Sengoku's legendary strategy, and Karp's iron will, were all ordered back to Marine headquarters. Their abrupt withdrawal only swelled Charles's pride. At dawn the next day, Charles hoisted his sails and plunged back into the fray. His blade danced with ferocity, and no pirate dared challenge his onslaught. The New World waters ran red with the echoes of his sword energy, and Charles, once again, proved why they called him the Swordsman of Blood. Charles cut down pirates faster than the Navy itself, though they still managed to slip ashore now and then for fresh plunder. He never killed indiscriminately, only the vile slavers identified by Locke's intelligence agent, Xiachi. These were men who trafficked in human lives. Every one of them bore blood on their hands. Inevitably, the Navy struck back. The world government's celestial dragons, furious over the disruption of their slave trade to the Holy Land of Marijoa, leaned heavily on naval command. Within weeks, Admiral Zephyr, known as the Black Arm of Navy headquarters, was dispatched to deal with the rogue pirate hunter. A year earlier, Charles had faced Zephyr and fled. He'd never seen running as shameful. If you can't win, you live to fight another day. But after 12 months of brutal sea trials, backed by the inexhaustible support of Rock D. Zebek, and honed by Locke's domineering combat techniques and swordsmanship, he had been reborn. Fleeing no longer appealed to him. On a windswept deck beneath a scudding gray sky, the two opponents stood opposite each other. Charles' grip on his sword was deliberate, every muscle coiled like drawn steel. Across from him, Zephyr's cold gaze betrayed no surprise. He had come expecting to settle this once and for all. The air crackled with tension. Charles welcomed it. He'd spent the past year sharpening himself in body, mind, and spirit, and now he needed a worthy adversary to test his edge. Zephyr would be that stone. A hush fell over the gathered sailors as swords cleared their sheaths. For Charles, the moment had arrived. No more running, no more unfinished business. This clash would decide who was stronger, and in the crucible of battle, one man would emerge victorious, tempered by the fires of conflict. Charles had just mastered the Navy's highest technique from the 6th Division, the return of life, and it had boosted his physical prowess once again. Tailor-made for him, this art sharpened his existing command of the 6 postures, and soon placed both the return of life and the 6 king guns firmly under his control. His upcoming duel with Zephyr on this uninhabited island would be the ultimate test of everything he'd cultivated over the past year. At the water's edge, two figures faced one another. Charles called out, a light smile playing on his lips. "Zephyr, long time no see. So you've come." Opposite him stood Zephyr, arms sheathed in jet-black armor, his naval justice cloak draped over our broad shoulders. His expression was unreadable, but his voice rang clear. "Pirate Charles, I hereby place you under arrest in the name of justice." With a swift motion, Zephyr drew the justice cloak tighter around him, and a domineering, high-level armament aura flared into being. Charles's smile only widened. He drew his long sword in a single fluid motion and leveled it at Zephyr's chest. "Very well," Charles said, voice steady. "Let's begin." His gaze blazed with confidence and challenge, as if daring the heavens themselves to watch their battle. Charles unleashed a colossal flying slash as a greeting to his opponent. Though he commanded it with fierce intent, he still wrestled to keep it perfectly steady. "Die, pirate scum!" Vice Admiral Zephyr bellowed, veins darkening with Haki. "Black wrist viper!" In an instant, Zephyr's fists blackened under armament Haki. He hurled a crushing punch straight at Charles's airborne blade. Boom! The impact rocked the island. Sand and dust exploded into the sky. High above the fray, Newshawk pilot Morgans wheeled on a thermal updraft, quill and talon, and eyes alight with excitement. This duel, Marine Vice Admiral versus Captain of the 8th Division of the Locke's Pirates, will shake the entire world. At his word, a flock of paper hawks streamed out behind him, bearing the breaking dispatch to every fleet and port. After his last disgrace, Morgans had vowed to reclaim his reputation, and Charles had deliberately summoned him here for exactly that reason. Thousands of miles away on Beehive Island, Admiral Locke slammed his fist onto the war table, papers fluttering. "All hands, prepare to mobilize. Set course for the Edgewall Sea area." His order reverberated through the pirate stronghold. In moments, every Locke's pirate's ship was clearing port, 7 captains and their crews ready to converge on whatever awaited Charles and Zephyr. "Ha! Would you look at that? This kid's caused quite a stir." Beside Locke, the golden lion Shiki laughed heartily. "He really is something else." The white-bearded pirate, Edward Newgate, took a slow sip of wine. At that moment, Shiki's power flared to life, and under the command of Xiachi, wave after wave of pirate ships rose into the sky, heading straight for the Edgewall sector of the New World. Back at Navy headquarters, alarms blared. "All hands to your posts. Prepare for immediate deployment. Admiral Steelbone Sora assembled the fleet, flanked by Vice Admirals Carp and Sengoku. Set course for the Edwall Sea area. Our mission, rescue Zephyr. At Sora's order, the Navy's warships boarded special world government transports and swept into the New World. Neither pirates nor Marines could have foreseen the scale of the confrontation that lay ahead. Charles, once known as Charlotte, simply wanted one more fight with Zephyr, with Morgan as his witness. Zephyr, upon spotting Charles, intended only to escort him back to the city. No one expected their brief encounter to ignite a full-scale war between pirates and the Navy. Ha! Zephyr, why does your punch feel weaker now? Charles taunted, blood trickling down his face in spite of the fierceness of his grin. He returned Zephyr's blow with a fist of his own, slamming it squarely into Zephyr's armored forearm. Zephyr staggered and used his other hand to guard his head, crimson lines staining the corner of his mouth. On the ground lay Charles's broken sword. No legendary blade, just a sword of slightly better quality than most, now snapped in two. Earlier, when Zephyr had shattered that weapon, he'd laughed. What sort of swordsman are you, without a sword? Show me your true skill now. He'd been convinced that disarming Charles would end the fight, but Zephyr had badly underestimated him. As soon as his blade was gone, Charles didn't weaken, he grew stronger. Charles himself had known this would happen. He'd spent years refining every movement, every twist of hip and snap of wrist, not for show but to forge true power in his arms. He understood all too well that 100-meter arc of flashing steel might imitate ordinary foes, but it counts for nothing against someone who knows how to fight with his bare hands. Now Charles pressed the advantage, each punch coming faster and harder than before, catching Zephyr completely off guard. The field echoed with the impact of their blows, but the roar of battle belonged to Charles. From the moment he arrived in this world, Charles knew he'd pursue the physical combat path. In his past life as a mercenary, he'd trained in nearly every hand-to-hand skill imaginable, though back then, he barely registered the extent of his own prowess. Now, thrown into a realm where might often makes right, those hard-won techniques and lethal instincts have become his greatest strengths. Charles's fists moved in a relentless flurry, each strike driven by muscle memory and honed reflexes. Watching him, Zephyr felt a surge of determination. He squared his shoulders, tightened his grip, and vowed to push himself just as fiercely. Chapter 37. The Restlessness of the Situation. Charles's fists struck against Zephyr's defenses again and again, but he couldn't find so much as a crack. Zephyr's armed overbearing guard, bolstered by his iron-hard wrist strength, held firm, repelling Charles's blows without faltering. Neither man could land a decisive strike, and for a moment they stood locked in mutual stalemate. "Call it off!" Charles barked through gritted teeth, seizing a brief opening in Zephyr's guard. He jabbed a quick inquiry over his shoulder. "How's it feel, Zephyr? My fist not doing you any favors, is it?" Zephyr's face darkened with grudging admiration. He met Charles's gaze, every ounce of scorn replaced by astonishment. "Charles the pirate," he growled, "we all underestimated you. We assumed you were only a swordsman, nothing more. Perhaps once this fight is done, you'll earn your reputation as a master of the blade, but unarmed, we never imagined you'd mastered it so completely." He tightened his stance and drove his own fist into Charles's guard, rattling it with full force. "I didn't expect you to have learned the internal rupture technique of the overbearing style, or the tangling embrace of overbearing energy. Tell me, where did you find the time to cultivate these arts in just 1 year? Zephyr's eyes followed Charles's every move, awe buried beneath clenched teeth. Between them, the air crackled with tension. Neither challenger would yield, and both now knew that this fight would be decided not by raw strength alone, but by the hidden depths of their skill. Charles stood defiantly before Zephyr, a wild grin on his face. "You remember how you chased me all over the Grand Line last year? Now look at me. After only 12 months of training, I'm on equal footing with you." He threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing across the rocky plateau. "Ha! You've got to admit people can grow. Since our last fight, I haven't stopped pushing myself. I've leveled, not 1 but 4 mountains." A crackling storm of Haki crackled around Charles, the black and red aura dancing like lightning as it battered Zephyr's senses. With every pulse of that otherworldly energy, Zephyr staggered backward. He shook his head in disbelief. What incredible power! I never thought someone like you, someone so young, would have the strength to join the Rock's pirates. Zephyr charged forward, landing blow after blow, each punch laced with incredulity. Why the Rock's pirates, Charles? Was the Navy really that pathetic? Charles absorbed the hits, eyes hot with determination. I didn't sign with them because the Navy failed me, he snapped between breaths. I wanted to sail sooner than anyone expected. At 17, I'm 3 years ahead of schedule, and I'll prove I belong on the world's fiercest decks. For a moment, silence fell between them. Charles clenched his fists, remembering the shame that drove him to piratehood. Zephyr paused, sensing both the guilt and the steel in Charles's conviction, and in that stillness, the two adversaries recognized the unspoken truth of their destined rivalry. At just 17, Charles had already achieved feats that left even the Navy's highest ranks uneasy. Who could say where his ambition would take him next? Would he one day outshine his captain, Lox, becoming yet another untamed power on the high seas? As the commander of the Rock's Pirates' 8th Division, his name was well known at Navy headquarters, whispered by admirals with both awe and apprehension. On the shoreline, Lieutenant General Zifa's roar echoed over the tumultuous surf. Enough talk. I'm hauling you off to Imper prison, whether you like it or not. Charles met Zifa's challenge with calm confidence. Go ahead and try. In a heartbeat, Zifa unleashed a colossal punch. Charles pivoted, absorbing the blow, then countered with a strike that crackled with raw authority. Their fists met in a single, thunderous impact. The ground beneath them fractured, ancient trees toppled, waves crashed violently against the rocks, sending spray high into the air. The shock rippled through every warship anchored along the coast, Navy and pirate alike, halting their cannons mid-salvo. Lieutenant General Zifa, a Navy officer cried out. Boss, echoed a pirate lieutenant. Both fleets fell silent, eyes riveted on the two warriors locked in mortal combat on the beach. The sky's cracking! Someone's shout cut through the roar of battle. Pirates and naval officers alike tilted their heads upward, jaws dropping at the sight above them. All around the island, the earth trembled as if caught in a colossal upheaval, none other than the ferocious clash between Zifa and Charles. This is insane. Get the word out. Morgan yelped, frantic fingers dancing over his equipment. He snapped shot after shot of the titanic duel, already plotting a live feed so every corner of the world could witness two of the greatest powerhouses tearing the very world apart. Indeed, the ground was splitting, the heavens were tearing open, and the sea himself churned in outrage, an unending spectacle of raw power. On the deck of the Lock's flagship, the crew howled with exhilaration. Wah! They're heading this way! Captain Locke's eyes glittered with anticipation as he extended a finger toward the distant horizon. At once, every pirate ship in the fleet surged forward, sails billowing and oars dipping in unison. They followed his command toward the heart of the storm. Not far off, the Navy's elite unit, led by the formidable cyborg Sky, bore down on the same turbulent waters. Clad in gleaming armor and backed by cutting-edge warships, Sky's squadron sliced through the waves. Move. We can't let Locke's pirates beat us to it, he barked into his communicator. Our target is the pirate Charles. Capture him before the Rock's pirates do. With that, Cyborg Sky's fleet broke into a swift, relentless pursuit, determined to claim the prize of the seas and to seize Charles before any rival crew could stake their claim. Admiral Kong slammed his fist on the rail. They're dead ahead! It's them! Commander Waring States, eyes narrowed against the spray, nodded. Understood. Full speed. Head right there. Cyborg Kongfinger, perched atop the foredeck, pointed toward the horizon. In an instant, more than a dozen Navy warships banked on their course and charged in that direction. This was no longer just another clash between Navy headquarters and the Rock's pirates. It wasn't merely Zifa versus Charles anymore. It was shaping up to be an all-out engagement. On number 17, Island of the Chambord Archipelago, a bustling tavern fell silent when a panting informant burst in, knocking over mugs. Captain Roger, we've got urgent news. Captain Roger sprang to his feet. Spill it! The Black Arm Specialist Zifa from Navy headquarters and Charles, the blood-sword hero and leader of the Rock's pirates, have already come to blows in the waters off Ed Wall. The Navy has dispatched a squadron of warships bound for the New World, and the Rocks pirates have mustered 16 large vessels of their own. They'll meet again in Edwall's waters, prepare for a massive battle. Every word hung in the smoky air as Roger's officers exchanged grim looks. Through secret channels, the Roger pirates had pieced together the full scope of what was coming, and it was nothing short of a naval war. Charles watched as Hades Rayleigh, first mate of the Roger pirates, brandished a fresh newspaper across the deck. "Really this time," Rayleigh said, tapping the front page. Charles and the others leaned in as Roger snatched it away, scanning the headlines with a deepening frown. "Hey!" Roger barked, tossing the paper aside. The crew exchanged weary looks at the two identical dispatches. The world was plunging into war once more. "All right, everyone," Roger called, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He strode to the rail and faced his men. "Our voyage ends here. We're going to join this conflict." A ripple of excitement ran through the Roger pirates. Rayleigh stepped forward, folding his arms with a grin. "Back to the New World, Captain?" Roger nodded solemnly. "We head straight for the New World. We'll fight alongside our allies." A thunderous roar rose from the deck. The pirates cheered so fiercely that even Lei Li, who'd been strolling aft, ducked his head in mock despair. "You lot never learn, do you, Rayleigh? I told you to steer clear of wars." Roger clapped Rayleigh on the shoulder. "Oh, please. Last I checked, you're not captain." Rayleigh threw up his hands and laughed. "Fair enough, but you heard the captain. Prepare the ships." From every corner of the deck, men and women hurried to coat their hulls and rigging in armament Haki. Soon their vessels gleamed with the hardened sheen of readiness. When at last the last plank was lifted, the Roger pirates slipped quietly away from Fishman Island and set their course for the fabled Edwall Sea, the gateway to the New World. The sky above Mary Geoas crackled with the thunder of cannon fire. From their vantage point on the floating island, the five elders watched as the Rocks pirates pressed their assault against the world government's most sacred stronghold. Elder Satan's voice cut through the din like a blade. "No, absolutely not. We need to bring in Cyborg Sora right away. This isn't the moment for a head-on collision with the Rocks pirates. Fall back at once." His order echoed across the battlefield, urging the defenders to regroup and prepare for the next move. Chapter 38. The confrontation between the two sides. "It's too late. Cyborg Kong has already departed. We only just discovered it. If you order a retreat now, where does that leave the world government's pride?" The five veteran officers known as the Old Stars of the Sword leveled their gazes at Satan. One of them barked, "Contact Sora at once and instruct him not to engage Rocks. This is no time for an all-out war with pirates." Satan met the steely stare of the sword star Wu Laoxing and gave a curt nod. At his signal, the remaining three sword stars turned to their counterparts, the Old Stars of the Blade, passing along the same orders. The Blade Stars exchanged uneasy glances, then one of them withdrew a concealed communicator from his arm. He pressed the activation switch. The device whirred and beeped until it finally connected. "Report," he demanded. "Sir, it's me, Master Wu Laoxing." On board the warship, Cyborg Kong clutched his own hand mic as he listened in. A cold dread settled over him when he heard Wu Laoxing identify himself. Whatever orders were coming next would seal his fate and possibly drag the world government into catastrophe. "Cease any hostilities against the Rocks pirates and bring Zephyr back at once." Through the Den Mushi's receiver, one of the Knife Elders spoke with unruffled calm. Cyborg Kong lifted the device to his ear, incredulous. "Why? What's the reason behind this order?" "There is no further explanation," the Elder replied coolly. "It's a direct command." Cyborg Kong hesitated. "Understood, but what about the Navy's honor? How can we retreat now without losing face?" "You forget your place," the Elder said brusquely. "The Navy exists only at the mercy of the world government. You have no standing to demand anything." With that, he clicked off the call. Cyborg Kong stared at the silent Den Mushi in his hand, a thin plume of steam rising from his helmet. Behind him, Vice Admiral Garp and Fleet Admiral Sengoku exchanged tense glances. "General," Garp urged, "this is our chance to wipe out the Rocks pirates once and for all. We've assembled every ship from the Shanghai naval base for this operation. If we back down now, we'll never get another opportunity." Sengoku nodded in agreement. We can't just stand down. We have them cornered. Cyborg Kong's fist clenched so hard the metal plating creaked. He slammed the Den Mushi onto the table. "Silence!" he thundered, his voice reverberating through the command room. "The world government has spoken. We follow their orders. No more, no less." As the echo of his words faded, Garp and Sengoku remained unmoved, their minds already racing with unspoken plans. Neither was prepared to abandon the battle so easily. "Follow orders," snarled Cyborg Kong, casting a hard look toward the sea. They were closing in on the battle zone. "Report," boomed the lookout from his tower. "General, an enormous fleet of Rock's pirates is approaching." "What? Already?" Kong sprang to his feet. Steel-boned Sora snatched up a pair of binoculars and trained them on the distant horizon. When he lowered them, his face was pale. 16 colossal pirate ships drifted into view, each bristling with hundreds of armed pirates. At the bow of the first vessel stood Edward Newgate, Whitebeard himself. On the next towered Golden Lion Shiki, his famous mane whipping in the wind. Further down the line loomed Charlotte Linlin, the fearsome Big Mom, her laughter echoing across the decks. Nearby stood Silver Axe John, his massive halberd gleaming menacingly. 2 other dread captains completed the roster, the full 6 lieutenants of the legendary Rock's pirates, arrayed like generals on parade. Then, from behind this imposing vanguard, the flagship of Rock's D, Xebec, emerged. With a staggering 2.3 billion berry bounty, he was the richest and most notorious pirate alive, and his mere presence sent a shiver through the entire Navy fleet. A stunned hush fell over the crews. None could believe their eyes. The greatest pirate alliance the New World had ever seen was bearing down upon them. The 2 opposing fleets hovered just 100 meters apart, yet neither side dared fire the first shot. From the bow of the Cyborg Navy's flagship Sky Station, a voice rang out across the water. "Lox! What are you doing here?" On the pirate ship Dark Tempest, Captain Lox grinned, his gaze fixed on a volcanic island in the distance, its crater still belching ash and molten rock. He threw back his head and laughed. "Why am I here? To collect my beloved crew, of course. General Sora, are you planning to stop me? Wahaha!" Captain Lox, his pirates roared in approval. Across the narrow channel, General Kong scowled. He turned to his officers. "Dispatch your rescue squad at once. Lieutenant General Zephyr must not be left behind." "Sir, yes, sir," they snapped to attention, and the cyborg warships pivoted toward the smoking isle. Aboard Dark Tempest, Lox waved an arm and hollered, "All right, lads, let's bring our people home." Then, louder still, he bellowed, "Bring back Captain Charles! Bring back Captain Charles!" At his command, the pirate fleet surged forward, sails snapping in the wind, every ship racing toward the embattled island to reclaim their comrades. Locke had no desire to start a full-scale war with the Navy, far too premature. He could wait until he'd secured that mysterious weapon before drawing first blood. As both pirate fleets closed in on the island, they were met with a sorry sight. The entire place looked ready to collapse at any moment. A booming laugh rang out across the sands. "Ha! That kid Charles is something else. He actually held his own against Zephyr." In truth, Charles hadn't even clashed directly with Zephyr yet. Shiki, the Golden Lion, who'd sparred with Admirals Sengoku and Garp more times than anyone could count, always spoke of Zephyr as one of the Navy's 3 greatest monsters. None of them expected a young swordsman to keep pace so long. Shiki threw back his head and roared. "I had no idea he was holding back." White-bearded Edward Newgate watched Charles's lightning-fast reflexes with genuine surprise. "I thought him a master swordsman and nothing more, yet his raw physical skill is unreal. We've all been fooled." Beside him, the giant John nodded slowly, his quiet observation prompting uneasy glances from the assembled captains. Rox D. Xebec, for his part, said nothing, his steely gaze fixed on Charles, intrigued by the boy's hidden depths. The naval officers stared in disbelief at Charles, whose skill now clearly rivaled Zephyr's. Captain John Guo rose to his feet, emotion thick in his voice. "By the heavens, how have we so badly underestimated Charles, the 8th Squadron's new captain?" Beside him, Commander Steelbone Kong slammed his fist against the railing, sparks of frustration flying. For 3 straight days and nights, Zephyr and Charles had waged an unrelenting duel. Their blows had rattled 2 shore-moored ships loose, leaving only the 2 combatants, locked in place, chest to chest, neither willing to yield. High above the chaos, the airship Morgans hovered in the clouds. Its crew had been eagerly photographing the arrival of the Navy headquarters fleet and the Rock's Pirates Armada. At first, excitement crackled through their ranks. But then something odd happened. "Hold on, they've just stopped?" the lead photographer muttered, lowering his camera. Both Zifa and Charles stood perfectly still, weapons at the ready but unmoving, no sign of another strike. A hush fell over Morgan's deck. Crew members exchanged puzzled looks as they peered down at the two frozen figures. Neither side showed the slightest urge to advance. The air hung heavy with tension, and a single, unspoken question: what would happen next? Charles slammed his fist against Zepha's. If nothing happens, there's no big story, so how can he, the self-proclaimed king of news, ever be satisfied? Damn it, I'll expose their hypocrisy for all to see. Across the table, Morgans was already mapping out tomorrow's naval deployment, determined to savage the fleet in the morning edition. With a loud crack, Charles and Zepha's fists collided one last time, each man's strength nearly spent. Chapter 39, Panic in the World. Laughter rolled across the waves as the two commanders faced off on the decks of their ships. "Zepha, are you done for?" Charles called, grinning at the opposing vessel. Admiral Zepha returned the smile, his voice carrying clearly in the sea air. "I was about to ask you the same, Captain." Their fists met with a thunderous crack, echoing like cannon fire. For a tense moment, neither man gave an inch. Then, without warning, they both wavered. The impact sent them staggering backward, and in the next heartbeat, they collapsed to the deck, limbs sprawled as if time itself had slowed. "Lieutenant General Zepha!" came the frantic cry from the naval warship. "Somebody, help him, quick!" At that command, dozens of naval sailors vaulted over the bulwarks and plunged into the churning water below. Across the channel, the lock pirates erupted into shouts of their own. "Captain Charles!" Pirate crewmen scrambled after their men, diving off the railings in a desperate race to reach Charles before he slipped beneath the surf. For an agonizing instant, both sides' elite fighters froze in place, fear of reigniting the duel holding them at bay. Then the two groups sprang into action, sending wave after wave of subordinates into the sea. Sailors and pirates alike plunged through rolling swells toward the unconscious commanders. Within moments, the rescuers hauled Zepha and Charles onto the beach, two motionless figures in the damp sand. Crews from both ships surged forward, forming circles around their fallen leaders. A lieutenant knelt beside Zepha, voice trembling. "Sir, can you hear me?" On the other side, another officer hovered anxiously over Charles. "Captain, stay with us." Soon makeshift litters were improvised from tarps and oars. Naval sailors carried Zepha back to their warship, while lock pirates bore Charles toward their own vessel. As each leader was borne away, a strange hush fell over the shoreline, a calm born of shock, not peace. The two fleets held their positions, neither advancing nor retreating. Waves lapped at the sand where their commanders had fallen, and for the first time in hours, the sea itself seemed to pause, waiting to see what would come next. A group of ship's doctors hurried forward to examine the fallen officers. Cyborg Sora bent over her scanner and looked up at the senior physician on deck. "Well, what's their condition?" The chief doctor, a slight woman with keen eyes, consulted her readings. "Extreme fatigue," she reported. "Severe energy depletion. They need rest and nutrient therapy immediately. No serious wounds, though. They're simply exhausted." At that news, Cyborg Kong let out a relieved breath. "Very well. Assist Lieutenant General Zepha to the lounge," he ordered. Several of the major generals lifted Zepha onto a stretcher and carried him below deck. Meanwhile, Sora swept her gaze toward the pirate flagship and called, "Captain Rox and Captain Charles, are they all right?" Her medical droid chirped in confirmation. "Both are stable, unconscious from exhaustion, but otherwise unharmed." If Charles had been awake, he would have recognized the doctor's name. It was Miss Bajin, mother of Edward Weibel, who would one day become king of Chiwuhai and the lead medical scientist aboard the Rox pirate's vessel. "Take them both down to the infirmary," Rox said, waving the doctor off with a casual gesture. He paused at the edge of the deck, eyes narrowing as he glanced at the assembled naval officers. A tense silence fell between the two forces. Then, in a sudden burst of laughter, Rox threw his head back. "Ha ha! Steelbone Kong, what do you say to a drink?" Cyborg Kong's plating creaked as he straightened, managing a stiff nod. Humph. Return. Lox gave a sharp flick to his crimson cloak and motioned to Steelbone Kong. At once, the Navy fleet pulled back, their warships wheeling away from the pirates. Lox threw back his head and laughed, the sound booming across the water. That's enough excitement for today. Back to Beehive Island, everyone. Without a word of protest, the Navy troops obeyed. Both fleets withdrew from the battlefield, leaving nothing behind but the echo of Lox's laughter. By dawn, the news had sparked a firestorm across the seas. Reports streamed in that Vice Admiral Zifa of Navy Headquarters had squared off against Charles, the renowned 8th officer of the Rock's pirates, and the duel had ended in a stalemate. Even more startling was word that Admiral Steelbone Sora himself had faced off against Captain Rox D. Gibbik in the treacherous waters near Ed Wall, yet once again, neither side had dared to open fire. Rumors spread like wildfire. Had the Navy grown weak, or were the Rock's pirates simply too formidable to challenge? From the Grand Line to the furthest corners of the New World, merchants and marines, pirates and bounty hunters alike felt a ripple of unease. If the world's strongest navy could be kept at bay, what threat might the future hold? The New World has erupted into chaos. Everywhere you look, among the underground rings of crime and in the royal courts of every nation allied to the world government, people are gripped by panic. The reason is clear: the Rock's pirates. Whichever island they touch, they leave ruin in their wake. In the past year alone, countless New World kingdoms have fallen, their peoples enslaved, their rulers slaughtered. Roger, we're too late, Raleigh hissed, pressing a freshly printed newspaper into Roger's hands the moment they sailed clear of Fishman Island. Roger's brow darkened as he scanned the headlines. Rock's pirates rampage across New World. Island after island falls. Mass enslavement reported. He clenched the paper until his knuckles whitened. Damn the Rocks, and that cursed Griff, he muttered under his breath. Across the Grand Line, at Navy headquarters, Admiral Steelbone Kong slammed his fist onto a new conference table. The impact shattered the wood into splinters. Cyborg Sora bristled beside him. Those Morgans are pushing the world to the brink of panic, Sora snarled. Admiral Kong's eyes blazed. Is that their plan? To watch the world burn? Sora shook her head. It's already happening, Admiral. Reports are flooding in from every fleet and every branch. Desperate people, merchants, fishermen, even marines, are defecting and taking up piracy just to survive. Kong let out a low, feral growl. Then we have no choice. We must stop the Rock's pirates before every last island in the New World falls into their hands. They're making a mad dash toward the Grand Line. Every fleet branch is clamoring for reinforcements. Warring States dropped the fresh dispatch into Admiral Ironbone Kong's hands. Kong scanned the report, then, with a roar of anger, tore it to shreds. Damn it, he bellowed. At that moment, Kong's communicator crackled to life. Admiral Wu Laoxing was calling. By order of the world government, your naval expansion plan has been approved. You may proceed with fleet enlargement. Wu Laoxing's voice was calm, but to Admiral Kong it sounded like the sweetest music. Thank you, Admiral, Kong replied, steadying himself. I swear our navy will become stronger than ever. He ended the transmission, and the sudden shift in his mood drew puzzled looks from Sengoku and Warring States. General Kong, what's going on? Sengoku asked. Warring States peered at Kong, equally confused. Kong slammed his fist onto the table. They've approved it. Our plan to expand the Navy is officially greenlit. His excitement was infectious. Warring States pumped a fist in the air. That's fantastic. The seas have never been more treacherous. We'll need every ship we can get. The sun had only just risen when John Guo burst into the conference hall, a broad grin on his face. Every day, countless pirates slip through our fingers, he announced. But at last, we've found a way to shore up our manpower. Cyborg Sora's mechanical eyes gleamed with resolve. With enough sailors on board, our navy will sweep the seas clean of those scoundrels. Sooner or later, they'll have nowhere left to hide. Steelbone Kong rose from his chair and peered down at John Guo. Then you know what to do. Draft a recruitment bulletin to go out across every port and kingdom. Let the world know the Royal Navy is growing and warn off anyone foolish enough to stand against us. Right away. John Guo saluted smartly and hurried from the room, already planning the wording of his announcement. On Beehive Island, Charles stirred on a vast canopy bed, his body entirely swathed in white bandages. Only his mouth and eyes remained exposed. As consciousness returned, he realized he was back in his own chambers, and that 5 of his loyal maids hovered anxiously by his side. One of them, Alice, sat closest, cradling a 2-year-old child nursing at her breast. The infant looked up, blinked, and then resumed feeding as though nothing had changed. "Master Charles," Alice whispered, relief flooding her voice, "you're awake!" Charles blinked twice, trying to clear the fog in his head. His throat felt dry. He managed a hoarse, "What happened?" Alice exchanged glances with the other maids before replying, "You were wounded in the pirate ambush, sir. Captain Sora insisted we bring you here to recover. You've been unconscious for 2 days." As Charles fought to sit up, the maids sprang into action, gently easing him back against the pillows. All around him, soft voices reassured him he was safe, and that the Navy was already preparing its grand expansion. Charles closed his eyes, bracing himself for the long road to healing. Across the seas, pirates were on notice. The Royal Navy was rising, and he would be back on deck before they knew it. Martha's sharp call drew the other maids to the bedside in an instant. "Sir," they exclaimed, crowding around Charles, Jenny among them, gently rocking the baby she'd brought along. One of the younger girls pressed forward. "What time is it?" Charles lifted his head, blinking against the bright light. He managed a faint smile. "You've been unconscious for 2 days," he murmured. "Today's the 3rd day since that battle with Zephyr." Martha stepped forward, a cool, damp towel in hand. "You gave us all a terrible fright, Master," she said softly, pressing the cloth to his forehead. "Take your time. There's no hurry." Surrounded by their concerned faces, Charles closed his eyes again, grateful for the familiar warmth of his household staff. Chapter 40. Esdeath. 3 days had passed since the battle with Zephyr, yet Charles still felt as if he'd been run through by a dozen swords. He tried to sit up, but pain shot through every muscle. His voice came out as little more than a croak. "Master Tai! Master Tai!" Footsteps rang in the room as Martha hurried to his side. Gently, she pressed him back onto the pillows and drifted a reassuring hand across his brow. Charles followed her movement with weary eyes and froze. Martha's stomach was clearly rounded beneath her gown. She was with child again. This would be their 3rd. He already had 2 little ones to care for, their toddling son and their 2-year-old daughter, Esdeath. The sight of her bright blue hair always reminded him of Martha, but recently that shade had grown even deeper, proof that Esdeath had inherited more than just her mother's color. A short while ago, Charles had left an ice devil fruit among his treasures and forgotten to lock it away. Curious as only a toddler can be, Esdeath had discovered it on his bedside table and taken a single bite. As pirates knew all too well, even one taste is enough to awaken a fruit's power. When Charles arrived home that evening, he'd found his daughter surrounded by drifting snowflakes, her hair tinged with an icy sheen. She'd tested her newfound ability with childlike delight, and the image both astonished and warmed his heart. Martha's fingers brushed gently against his temple. "Don't strain yourself," she said softly. "You've had a hard fight, but you'll recover." Charles closed his eyes and let out a slow breath. In the quiet that followed, he felt the promise of healing, both for himself and soon for their growing family. Charles couldn't help but smile at how much his eldest daughter reminded him of an anime character he'd adored in his past life. That nostalgia was exactly why he'd named her Esther. Now, at 2 years old, Esther was an unstoppable force, crawling all over the ship and inadvertently wreaking havoc every time her devil fruit powers flared out of control. The crew had already dubbed her the Little Witch, a nickname that left Charles equal parts amused and exasperated. It was a clear sign of how much everyone cared for her. After all, Esther was his firstborn. His second daughter, Gillian, had arrived just 2 months ago and had yet to be christened with a proper name. Between the beating Charles had taken from Zephyr, which forced him to ease up on his punishing training schedule, and their endless days at sea, Esther had naturally claimed his full attention. Gillian had stayed behind on Beehive Island with her nurse, and in the chaos of it all, Charles simply never made it back. Now the infant slept peacefully in her crib, oblivious to the world above deck. "Bring Esther here," Charles called to Jenny. Jenny hesitated, glancing back toward the deck where Esther was balancing precariously on a barrel. Charles met her eyes. He knew exactly what she was thinking. She was afraid the child's powers might lash out, but he was determined. Now, he repeated, softer this time, but with the unmistakable authority of a father who wouldn't take no for an answer. Charles watched Jenny struggle to mask her teeth chattering as Esdeath's icy aura sliced through the air. Had Jenny not gone through his training regimen, she might already be dead from those sub-zero blasts. His heart tightened at the thought. He would never let a child sample a devil fruit so young. No matter who it was, they'd pay the price. "It's all right," Charles said, never wavering. "Bring her to me." Jenny bit her lip but nodded. In her arms, she carried a small bundle of soft, powder-blue hair, Esdeath's child. Placing the infant beside him, Jenny stepped back. The baby, pacifier bobbing between her lips, gazed up at Charles with wide, trusting eyes. Charles extended a tentative hand and brushed one pudgy cheek. A sudden chill radiated through his fingers. This was the curse of the ice fruit. The user felt nothing, yet to anyone else their body became an instant icebox. The chi, Elid let out a soft babble. "Mama! Mama!" and instinctively slapped his hand away, her tiny palm surprisingly strong. Charles lifted his fingers, smiling despite the cold. Strength like this, with it, he could truly protect those he cared for. "Esdes!" Jenny called out anxiously as her daughter reached for Charles's hand. "He's fine." Charles gave Jenny a reassuring smile. Physically, he was unharmed, just a little weak. He needed food. "Send up every roast and meat dish you have," he instructed. At his command, a maid in crisp uniform appeared in the doorway. Moments later, over a dozen housemaids filed in, each bearing platters piled high with barbecue and savory dishes. They arranged the feast on the table before him. Charles raised his hand. "Help me sit up." Alice and Nell were instantly at his side, easing him into a chair. They knew exactly what their young master had in mind, a full meal to restore his strength. With Charles seated, the maids began slicing the roasted meat into bite-sized portions and feeding him. Charles chewed deliberately and swallowed. Then, with a steady voice, he said, "Don't stop." "Yes, sir," they answered in unison. Charles sat at the long oak table, 5 maids flanking him on either side. One by one, they spooned steaming bites into his mouth, never pausing until every last morsel on their plates had vanished. In this household, only the first 5 who pledged themselves to him were permitted to use the honorific young master. The others, girls with no home or kin, had drifted into his care, bound to him by gratitude and the simple fact that he was the only one who offered them shelter. Despite the chef's finest creations appearing in rapid succession, Charles's appetite proved insatiable. He downed each plate within moments. Wiping his mouth, he nevertheless felt hollow, as if a great emptiness yawned inside him. "Send someone to the kitchen," he commanded, eyes still on the empty platters. "Tell them to prepare. No, 3 more servings." "Very well, young master," the nearest maid curtsied. She hurried off without a backward glance. Charles could already feel newfound strength pulsing through his arm, proof that the banquet was restoring him. He raised his hand and began to unwind the long bandage that wrapped his torso. The gauze rustled under his fingers as he peeled it away. "Ah, my lord!" The 5 maids gasped in unison, rushing forward in alarm. They reached out, desperate to stop him, but the last strip of cloth slipped free and fell to the floor. For a blessed instant, the room held its breath. Charles froze, staring down at himself. The truth registered at once. "Why? I'm not wearing anything under here." His cheeks burned red as the maids shrieked and backed away, their skirts swishing in panic. Charles hastily bent to gather the discarded bandage, trying to preserve what little dignity remained. But the moment was gone. All he managed was a hasty apology as he draped the linen about his shoulders. The kitchen's clatter, the distant hum of conversation, nothing could erase the maid's wide-eyed stares. In the sudden, awkward silence, Charles forced himself to laugh. Well, that was unexpected. He cleared his throat, folded the bandage neatly, and tucked it away. "Let's focus on those extra dishes, shall we?" Reluctantly, the maids nodded, and once more they set aside their embarrassment to serve the one who had rescued them all. Charles stood before the 5 maids, his cheeks damp with shame. No matter how thick-skinned he tried to be, he couldn't bear standing naked in front of so many strangers. "Master, Take this, Martha snapped, draping a thick cloak over his shoulders. Everyone else, out, she ordered, and the other maids hurried from the room. Even after they'd gone, though, their averted gazes lingered on Charles's back. Most of them were teenagers, a few in their early 30s, still too young to ever worry about being unsold at the slave market. With the door closed, Charles let out a shaky breath. Martha helped him into his clothes, and with every buttock fastened, his racing heart began to calm. Fully dressed at last, he staggered to the long table piled high with steaming platters. His stomach growled. It had been hours since he'd eaten properly. Without waiting for a maid to spoon-feed him, he grabbed chunks of bread and hunks of meat, shoveling them into his mouth as though he'd been starved for days. The pace was frantic. He barely paused between bites. By the time his first plate lay empty, gravy stained his cloak and strands of hair clung to his forehead. Before he could even ask for more, Martha reappeared, followed by several maids bearing fresh stacks of plates. From the kitchen beyond came the hiss and clatter of sizzling pans, evidence that the chefs were racing to keep up with his ravenous appetite. Charles wiped his mouth, bracing himself for the next onslaught of food. The dinner service had only just begun,